The Last Circle. The Last Circle, by Cheri Seymour aka Carol Marshall, is helpful to everyone who is trying to get an understanding of where this came from and how the New World Order is planning on using discoveries from the concentration camps in Germany, the human genetic guinea pigs in Japan, and the gulags of the USSR to eliminate 4/5% of the world's population. And in doing so, set themselves up as the only rulers of planet Earth. Chapter 7. Through one of Michael's contacts, I was able to obtain the corporate documents on FIDCO Corporation, First Intercontinental Development Corporation. This formidable organization led me straight to the head of the Octopus. The board of directors of FIDCO consisted of the following principals: Robert Muir, SR, Vice President, Director, former FBI agent, former CEO of Howard Hughes Operations, Senior Consultant to Leisure Industries. 2. Michael A. McManus, Director, Vice President and General Counsel to FIDCO, former Assistant to the President, Reagan, of the United States at the White House in Washington, D.C. 3. Robert Booth Nichols, Director, Senior Vice President and Chairman of Investment Committee, Chief Executive Officer of RBN Companies, International, a holding company for manufacturing and development of high-technology electronics, real estate development, construction and international finance. 4. George K. Pender, Director, former Director of Pacific Ocean Area of Burns & Roll, Incorporated, an international engineering and construction corporation with active projects on all 7 continents of the world. Senior Engineer Consultant to Burns & Roll, Incorporated. 5. Kenneth A. Rowe, Director, Chairman and President of Burns & Rowe, Incorporated, International Engineers and Constructors, a family corporation owned by Kenneth Rowe and family. Major current project of the company is the engineering, design and construction of the USA fast breeder nuclear reactor plant in conjunction with Westinghouse Electric Corporation, which is responsible for the nuclear system supply of steam. Construction value of present business backlog of Burns & Rowe, Incorporated is in excess of $6 billion. 6. Francis D. Fox, Vice President and Director, former General Manager of LA International Airport, former Director of Aviation for Howard Hughes Nevada Operations, now called Summer Corporation, City Manager of San Jose, California. 7. Clint W. Murchison, Junior Director, owner of the Dallas Cowboys NFL football team. 8. William M. Pender, Director and Senior Vice President, Licensed Contractor, State of California. 9. Glenn R. Shockley, Director Consultant to Fortune 500 companies in business management. Internationally known as Financial Consultant in Funding. The list of directors was accompanied by a letter dated January 11, 1983 on FIDCO letterhead originating out of Santa Monica, California, addressed to Robert Booth Nichols in Marina del Rey, California. The letter, signed by George K. Pender, briefly referenced a copy of a resolution resulting from a meeting of the Board of Directors of FIDCO. On April 13, 1983, Robert Booth Nichols wrote a letter to Joseph F. Priedloznik in Madison, Wisconsin, outlining proposed arms projects, one of which was to build a 2-story building of approximately 7,500 square feet with concrete walls and floors to house the R&D position. I later found the R&D facility referenced in a 1981 Wackenhut Interoffice Memorandum as a companion facility to Wackenhut to be constructed on the Cabazon Indian Reservation for the assembly of shell casings, propellants, warheads, fuses, combustible cartridge cases and other weapons systems. Nichols wrote to Priedloznik, "Should there be any questions with regard to my credibility, verification can be made through FIDCO. I have enclosed a copy of that appointment." If in fact, FIDCO was a vehicle of the Octopus, then the tentacles of its board of directors lead straight to the head. Clint Murchison, Jr. of Dallas, Texas was the son of Clint Murchison, Sr. who, according to Dick Russell, author of the book, The Man Who Knew Too Much, pp. 521,523, was cut from the same political cloth as H. L. Hunt. Wrote Russell, back in 1951, after General Douglas MacArthur was relieved of his Korean command by President Truman, H. L. Hunt accompanied MacArthur on a flight to Texas for a speaking tour. Hunt and Murchison were the chief organizers of the pro-MacArthur forces in Texas. They would always remember the general standing bareheaded in front of the Alamo, urging removal of the burden of taxation from enterprising men like themselves, charging that such restraints were imposed by those who seek to convert us to a form of socialistic endeavor, leading directly to the path of communist slavery. According to Russell, Hunt went on to set up a MacArthur for President headquarters in Chicago, spending $150,000 of his own money on the general's reluctant 1952 campaign, which eventually fell apart as MacArthur adopted the strident rhetoric of the right wing. Still, connections were made, wrote Russell. Charles Willoughby, for example, was a regular part of the MacArthur-Hunt entourage and undoubtedly was acquainted with Murchison as well. Both, the Hunts and the Murchisons, cultivated not only powerful people on the far right, but also J. Edgar Hoover, Richard Nixon, organized crime figures, and Lyndon Johnson, whose rise to power emanated directly from his friends in Texas oil. Like Hunt, Murchison was an ardent supporter of Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade. McCarthy came often to the exclusive hotel that Murchison opened in La Jolla, California, in the early 1950s. So did Richard Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover. In 1961, after Nixon had lost the presidential election to JFK the previous year, Murchison sold Nixon a lot in Beverly Hills for only $35,000, a lot Murchison had financed through a Hoffa loan which Nixon sold 2 years later for $86,000. When Hoover visited their Murchison Hotel Del Charro, as he did every summer between 1953 and 1959, Murchison picked up his tab. That amounted to about $19,000 of free vacations for the FBI director over those years. Whether Hoover knew it or not, almost 20% of the Murchison Oil Lease Company in Oklahoma was then owned by Gerardo Catena, chief lieutenant to the Genovese crime family. By the autumn of 1963, a major scandal was brewing around Bobby Baker, whom Vice President Lyndon Johnson had made Secretary of the Senate Democrats in 1955, when LBJ was Majority Leader. LBJ called Baker "my strong right arm, the last man I see at night, the first I see in the morning." On October 8, 1963, Baker was forced to resign, as the Senate investigation of his outside business activities began producing sensational testimony on numerous questionable deals. Baker's deals were tightly interwoven with the Murchison family and the mob, wrote Dick Russell. What first attracted the attention of Senate investigators was a lawsuit brought against Baker in 1963 by his associates in a vending company, alleging that he failed to live up to certain bargains. Those associates were, for the most part, Las Vegas gamblers. One of them, Edward Levinson, was a lieutenant of Florida mobster Meyer Lansky, whose Fremont Hotel in Vegas was financed through a Hoffa loan. Baker, it later turned out, did considerable business with the mob in Las Vegas, Chicago, Louisiana, and the Caribbean. Through Baker, Levinson had also gotten to know Clint Murchison. Clint Murchison, Jr., listed on the board of directors of Fidco, tried to persuade the Senate Rules Committee in 1964 that his own real estate dealings with Jimmy Hoffa in Florida were hardly relevant to the Baker investigation. Robert Muir, Senior Vice President and Director of FIDCO, was also mentioned in Russell's book, The Man Who Knew Too Much, pp. 190. Wrote Russell, back in 1960, with then Vice President Richard Nixon serving as the White House's liaison to the CIA's Cuban operations, the CIA had initiated its long series of assassination attempts against Castro. The cutouts in the operation started with Las Vegas billionaire Howard Hughes's right-hand man, Robert Mueller, who got in touch with organized crime leaders Sam Giancana, Johnny Rosselli, and Santos Trafficante, Jr. They in turn enlisted the direct assistance of Cuban exiles. Throughout my conversations with Michael Riconosciuto, the names of Robert Booth Nichols, George Pender, Glenn Shockley and Michael McManus, other directors of FIDCO, cropped up repeatedly, but I found few references to them in any published books or magazines. Riconosciuto often stated that George Pender and Glenn Shockley were CIA officials, which I later corroborated through Peter Zokoski, a partner of Robert Booth Nichols's. In August 1994, I did, however, manage to obtain 3 significant letters with the signatures of Michael A. McManus and George Pender on them. The following letters on FIDCO confirm its presence in Lebanon. Letter number 1, written on White House letterhead stationery, dated June 29, 1983, from Michael A. McManus, Assistant to the President, Reagan, to George K. Pender in Santa Monica, California. Dear George, it was good to see you again. I appreciate the update you and your associates gave me concerning the status of your efforts in the rebuilding of Lebanon. Without question, FIDCO seems to have a considerable role to offer, particularly in the massive financial participation being made available to the government of Lebanon. As you are aware, the United States government is providing financial aid. We are very interested in the success of the rebuilding effort in Lebanon. I will appreciate your continuing to keep me posted. Best personal regards. Sincerely, Michael A. McManus, Assistant to the President. It is interesting to note that in 1982, 1 year before the above letter was written, Israel invaded Lebanon in a bid to crush the PLO strongholds there and install the Gamal family in power. At that time, Tel Aviv was supporting the ultra-right Christian Phalange militia. It was the Christian Phalange militia which first brought Lebanon into the heroin trade, and the powerful Christian Gamal family which led the way in turning to outside forces for money, guns and political support. Foremost among those sources was the international heroin trafficking network. This according to Bill Weinberg, editor of High Times magazine, who wrote the in-depth article, The Syrian Connection, in March 1993. Weinberg also noted that as far back as 1955, U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee hearings learned that Sami El-Khoury, the Gamal's chief of finances, was importing raw Turkish opium into Lebanon, where it was processed into heroin and then shipped to Sicily for re-export throughout America and Europe. El-Khoury controlled the Gamal family's shipping lines, trading, trucking and air freight companies. El-Khoury's machine was the Lebanese wing of the French Connection, the wing that continued to do business with the Sicilians in a bid to propel the Gamal family to power. After the Israeli invasion, the Lebanese parliament elected to the presidency Becker Gamal, who had long been on the CIA payroll. But before he could take office, Bashar was killed by an assassin's bomb, and Becker's brother, Amin, was installed as president. The following letter from George Pender, president of FIDCO, to President Amin Gamal in Beirut is printed in its entirety here. Letter number 2, written on FIDCO letterhead stationery, dated July 12, 1983, from George K. Pender, president of FIDCO, to President Amin Gamal, Presidential Palace, Beirut, Lebanon. Dear Mr. President, I had visited Beirut in February and May 1983 to discuss FIDCO participation in the redevelopment of Lebanon. These meetings were held with the chairmans, Morris Ghanem and Murad Baraldi. Of particular interest is the fact that FIDCO offered to arrange the financing of projects considered, provided they were in the government sector. Unfortunately, the response, to date, is dragging, and a golden opportunity for Lebanon is slowly dying. I had made no effort to see you at that time, as I thought it more prudent to delay until I had something more tangible to present. I expressed specific interest in the rebuilding of Dama and Al-Qayyam. FIDCO has presented these projects to an international trust with whom we have a close relationship, and we are very confident that we can arrange the funding under International Chamber of Commerce format, provided FIDCO can negotiate turnkey contracts on both projects. We are ready, willing and able to proceed immediately on this basis. I understand you will be at the White House on July 22. Would it be possible for me to meet with you in Washington, D.C. on July 21 briefly so that I may personally present our interest in Lebanon? As per copy of attached letter, the White House is actively interested in our efforts. For your personal information, I was a good friend of Becker. I was with him in Beirut in 1976 when the Syrian army came into police. When he later visited the United States on a speaking tour, my wife and I went to Framingham, Massachusetts to meet with him. I miss him tremendously. I would appreciate your reply as soon as possible. You can also reach me via telex 652,483 RBN, Robert Booth Nichols, Essex LSA. Thank you for your time and consideration. Sincerely yours, George K. Pender. I cannot stress enough the importance of this letter from George Pender to Amin Gamal. In the very first paragraph of Pender's letter he noted that Morris Ghanem participated in the meetings held in Beirut in May 1983 to discuss FIDCO's participation in the redevelopment of Lebanon. Michael Riconosciuto had stated, on page 40 of this manuscript, that he had worked directly under Morris Ghanem and George Pender in Lebanon. Riconosciuto had explained that Morris had a relative, either a brother or a cousin, who was a senior DIA official with Michael Hurley. Then, in a 1993 book entitled Trail of the Octopus by Donald Goddard with Lester Coleman, on page 152, I stumbled across the name of Fred Ghanem in the following context. The number of DEA-controlled deliveries of heroin down the pipeline to the United States had increased noticeably during the winter as a result of Fred Ghanem's special knowledge of the Lebanese communities in Detroit, Houston and Los Angeles. This was independent corroboration of a link between FIDCO George Pender and Michael McManus, and the very same heroin operation in Nicosia, Cyprus, which Riconosciuto had described in detail to me in December 1991. It also directly connected George Pender with Michael T. Hurley. Goddard and Coleman recounted how members of the Jaffa clan and other DIA couriers would arrive at Larnaca with suitcases full of high-grade heroin, white and crystal, and be met off the boat by officers of the Cypriot Police Narcotics Squad, who then drove them up to the Urumi office in Nicosia. In his interview with RJ page 37, Riconosciuto had maintained that FIDCO had a companion company called Urumi Trading. 3 years later, Trail of the Octopus described Urumi as such. Coleman was given a desk at the Urumi Trading Company, Limited, a DIA, CIA front newly set up by the Cypriot Police Narcotics Squad in a luxury 3-bedroom penthouse apartment down the street from the U.S. Embassy. It gave him the creeps from the start. Intended as a place where DIA and CIA agents could meet unobserved with informants and clients, as a message drop for CIA arms dealers supplying Iraq and the Afghan rebels, as a waiting room for DIA citizen couriers from Lebanon, and as a transit point, not just for heroin, but for cash, documents and bootleg computer software moving to and fro along Beirut-Nicosia pipeline. URAM, as run by Al Jor, was more like a low-life social club than a secret intelligence center. Coleman had complained to Hurley, but Hurley had just brushed it aside. It is noteworthy that George Pender listed Robert Booth Nichols's telex number at the bottom of his letter to Lebanon President Amin Gamal. During that time span, Nichols and Pender, when they weren't in Lebanon, were operating a NSC listening post from a condo at Marina del Rey. It was allegedly the U.S. end of the Nicosia, Cyprus operation. Michael Riconosciuto, Ted Gunderson and Alan Boyack, an attorney representing Riconosciuto, all had stories to tell about apartment number 007. More on this in a moment. Next, was the Lebanese response to George Penda's aforementioned letter, number 2. Letter number 3, written on Arab Bank Limited letterhead, dated November 23, 1983, from Abdul-Majid Shaman, Chairman, General Manager of Arab Bank Limited in Amman, Jordan, to George K. Penda in Santa Monica, California. Dear Mr. Penda, Mr. Ahmad has talked to me about the fund to reconstruct Lebanon, and with the Arab Bank together with a group of other banks will be glad to cooperate with you concerning this respect. We shall discuss, in future, how this cooperation will be made and on what conditions and plans. You have mentioned in your letter to Mr. Ahmad on September 27 that this fund amounts to $3 billion or more. There is no problem to take care of this by the Arab Bank and the other group of banks as stated above. The terms and conditions will be discussed with you provided the condition is clear in Lebanon and subject to the approval and counter guarantees of the Lebanese Authority. Yours sincerely, Abdul-Majid Shaman, Chairman, General Manager. It is unlikely any reconstruction, funded by FIDCO, ever took place in Lebanon. Only a congressional investigation could determine what the $3 billion was actually used for. The next document, pertaining to Robert Booth Nichols, Senior Vice President of FIDCO, originated from an interview between Jeffrey Steinberg, a writer for Executive Intelligence Review, and Alan Boyack, an attorney in Utah whom Michael Riconosciuto contacted immediately after his arrest in Washington state. Michael T. Hurley had allegedly been transferred from Nicosia, Cyprus to Deer in Washington state shortly before Michael's arrest. Riconosciuto's arrest had taken place within a week after signing the Inslaw affidavit. It is noteworthy that Danny Casolaro also contacted and interviewed Alan Boyack shortly before his death. According to Ted Gunderson and others who knew Danny, Boyack met with Casolaro in Washington, D.C. and provided him with a copy of a transcript of the meeting between himself, Boyack, Riconosciuto, and Ted Gunderson, who at that time was Riconosciuto's investigator. I later obtained the same transcript from Gunderson's live-in partner, J.M., and have related the contents of that explosive transcript in Chapter 13. Meanwhile, the following memorandum for the file, dated 62,591, was written by Steinberg after his interview with Boyack, excerpted. I met at length Saturday, June 22, 1991 with Alan Boyack, an attorney from Utah who is representing Michael Riconosciuto in his pending drug case. Boyack is not the lead attorney and will not apparently be making court appearances in the case. Boyack recounted the following personal background information. He was in the U.S. Army in Special Forces and apparently did some contract work for the CIA during the 1960s and early 1970s. At some point in the early 70s, he worked briefly for the Drug Enforcement Administration, or its antecedent agency, being stationed in California. Boyack had some falling out with the DEA and left the government service altogether, entering law school. While in law school, Boyack became friendly with Jim Nichols, a classmate. Nichols told him that he had a brother who was heavily involved in organized crime and had been disowned by his family. Once out of law school, Boyack joined a Hollywood law firm and became involved in criminal defense work, representing a number of well-placed West Coast drug traffickers. At some point, Boyack moved to Utah. He is a practicing Mormon, while retaining his California law practice on a part-time basis. In addition to his OC organized crime clientele, Boyack also maintained contacts and apparently did some legal work for some of his old buddies from his Green Beret and CIA days. One such pal was Art Suchesk, who ran a CIA proprietary company called Hoffman Electronics. At some point in the late 1970s, one of Boyack's clients, a Mormon old boy named Cap Cressop, who was a technical wizard, was approached by Robert Nichols and asked to manufacture a prototype laser sight for a rifle. Cresop was offered a $200,000 contract for the job, but he became suspicious when Nichols wanted to pay him in cash. Boyack contacted Nichols at his Marina del Rey, California home, office, apartment 007, and the two had a lengthy meeting there. Boyack's description of that meeting is that it was continuously interrupted by telephone calls and telex messages. Boyack came away convinced that Nichols was involved in large-scale illegal drug operations. After consulting with one of his close friends from Green Beret days, then an assistant U.S. attorney named Dexter Leitner, now the Miami U.S. attorney, Boyack went to the Los Angeles FBI office with the suspicions about Nichols' activities. The FBI background check, conducted by Ted Gunderson, on Robert Booth Nichols, born 1943 or 1944, he couldn't remember for sure, revealed that he was squeaky clean. In fact, he had a Class I machine gun license. Boyack did discover, however, that one of the people Nichols referenced as a business associate and personal friend, Harold Okamoto, was believed by some of his sources to be a top Japanese organized crime figure based in Hawaii. Okamoto was described as a top agent in the Yakuza overseas. Over the next 2-year period, after the LA FBI had dropped any interest in the Nichols matter, Boyack's friend, Arthur Suchesk, repeatedly ran into Nichols in such places as Singapore, the Philippines, and Taiwan. Suchesk was based out of Zurich, Switzerland during this period, apparently still doing his front-man work for the CIA. Boyack says that information developed during this period, through Suchesk and others, indicated that Nichols was indeed a big-time drug dealer who was very well insulated from any U.S. law enforcement problems. Nichols operated exclusively overseas. Whenever he came to the United States, he never engaged in any illegal activities. However, Boyack described Nichols' rum importing business as a cover for big-time heroin trafficking from the Golden Triangle. Nichols was also named as Mr. Big, according to Boyack, in the Medellin cartel, in drug prosecutions in Utah and Los Angeles. 3 to 4 years ago, Boyack received an out-of-the-blue telephone call from Michael Riconosciuto. Michael identified himself as a former employee of Robert Nichols. He also referenced Ted Gunderson as a mutual friend. Boyack had only met Ted once very briefly when he was pressing the LA FBI to look into the Nichols dope suspicions. Then in April 1991, Boyack received a phone call from Ted Gunderson, informing him that Michael was in trouble. He was caught in a government frame-up. Boyack returned to his background profile of Bob Nichols, parts of which were apparently provided by Bob's estranged brother, Jim Nichols. It seems that as a young man, Robert Nichols wound up in Hawaii functioning as a hitman for the Tongs. He was adopted as the Yakuza godson of Harold Okamoto, a 67-year-old car dealer in Hawaii. Nichols grew up to be a big business frontman for the Far East Syndicate. He reportedly laundered between $50,200 million for Ferdinand Marcos. He now owns an estate in Hawaii, a feudal castle outside of Milan, Italy, and the reference Marina del Rey home in California. Nichols has an office in Zurich. At one point, he was reportedly involved in the smuggling of China white heroin into Mexico, where it was treated to look like the Mexican brown heroin, which was more popular at the time. It should be emphasized that all of this information about Robert Nichols comes exclusively from Alan Boyack. None of it has yet been independently corroborated to my knowledge. Bill Hamilton and some other people involved in tracking the Inslaw story have all spoken to Robert Nichols and report that he has been straightforward with them and has provided leads and documents. Michael Riconosciuto. Nichols is listed on the board of directors of First Intercontinental Development Corporation, FIDCO, along with George Pender and several officials of the Howard Hughes Linksima Corporation. One of the most surprising and disturbing documents I found in Michael Riconosciuto's hidden files, see Chapter 9, was an envelope with a notation on it, handwritten and signed by Ted Gunderson, which read as follows. Michael Raymond Lavers is arriving at LAX, 7:55 p.m., Air Canada via Flight 793 from Toronto. We'll have to go through customs. This will give us another member for our drug arms operation. Only problem is, Raymond will probably be using instead of selling. Sorry I didn't get to DA office. I tried to call, but no answer. By the time I fought the traffic to the bank and did my banking, it was too late. We'll be home tonight. 818, 8,806,238. TG. Raymond Lavers was Ted Gunderson's forensic expert when he worked for the FBI. Lavers was in constant contact with Bobby Riconosciuto after Michael was incarcerated. In fact, everyone was watching Michael and Bobby very closely. Chapter 8. In March 1993, 2 years after Michael Riconosciuto had attempted to trade information on the F.I.D.C.O./Urami drug intelligence operation in Lebanon to the government, the aforementioned magazine article printed in High Times magazine by Bill Weinberg, entitled, "The Syrian Connection, Exposed CIA Penetration into the Bekaa Valley Drug Trade in Lebanon." Essentially, this article validated much of Riconosciuto's earlier information. The following are some excerpts. Many of Lebanon's armed factions depend on the international drug trade for funds, wrote Weinberg. Each paramilitary group controls its own port in or around Beirut, which serves as a transfer point for drugs on the way out of Europe and America and weaponry on the way in from the international market. Whoever holds the fertile Bekaa Valley holds the ticket to power. As the war escalated in the late 1970s, hashish, the traditional mainstay of the Bekaa, started to be replaced by the more lucrative heroin. Marijuana fields were converted to opium fields, hashish production compounds converted to heroin labs. Heroin production exploded in the Bekaa Valley under the Syrian occupation. However, the Syrian occupation forces didn't touch the drugs, but profited from the trade and protected it. It was estimated that up to $2 billion in protection money was paid annually by dope plantation operators to Syrian occupation forces. DU official Felix Jimenez told a reporter in 1990 that the Syrian occupation received $10,000 per kilogram of Bekaa heroin. With the valley producing over £20,000 a year, that was a lot of money. Bekaa also became a center for processing Colombian cartel cocaine for re-export to European markets. In 1988, 2 Syrians arrested with large quantities of heroin and coke in Milan, Italy, claimed to be working for a Syrian colonel in Bekaa. Prior to Desert Storm, Syria's President Hafez Assad and Iraq's Saddam Hussein were rival factions in the Arab nationalist Ba'ath Party. Syria was the only Arab nation to back Iran in the long and brutal war against Iraq in the 1980s. So when President George Bush invited Syria to join the Arab coalition against Saddam after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, Assad accepted. After Desert Storm, Assad closed ranks with the White House and even softened his stand against Israel. President Bush and Secretary of State James Baker peddled a post-war peace plan for the region, and Syria and Israel were encouraged to recognize each other's Lebanese occupation zones. Under a 1990 accord, Christians and Muslims were finally granted equal representation, officially bringing the civil war to an end. A new Syria-backed Muslim government came to power. Under the accord, Syria maintained control of the Bekaa Valley. Among the areas still under Syrian control were the notorious drug ports north of Beirut. High Times maintained that there were long-standing back-channel relations between Washington, D.C. and Damascus. According to a 1987 Pentagon memo leaked to the Chicago paper, in these times, Lieutenant Cole Oliver North was personally notified that Syrian intelligence in Lebanon was willing to negotiate with the White House for release of the hostages held by Lebanese terrorists. The Washington Jewish Week reported that Bush himself had made secret visits to Damascus for hostage negotiations. But there were other reasons for the U.S. to be in Lebanon. In 1988, when Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Scotland, Pan Am hired the private investigative firm of Interfor to look into the bombing. The owner, Yuval Aviv, was reportedly a former Mossad agent. Interfor maintained that the Syrian-backed Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, PFLP-GC, was behind the bombing. The PFLP-GC had been able to get their bomb on board the 747 because the flight was part of a heroin smuggling route run by a drug trafficking ring connected to the Syrian regime and protected by both the USDA and the CIA. Interfor claimed the ring was overseen by Syrian kingpin Mansour al-Qasr, often known as the world's biggest arms dealer. The CIA was protecting the al-Qasr operation because he was cooperating with efforts to free U.S. hostages in Lebanon. Reporter Bill Weinberg added that the CIA and DIA had apparently both instructed Germany's internal intelligence agency, the BKA, to allow certain suitcases to pass uninspected on US-bound flights at the Frankfurt airport, where Flight 103 originated. Apparently, unknown to anyone except the PFLP-GC and al-Qasr, a suitcase which was supposed to be full of the usual heroin was covertly substituted with a suitcase full of explosives. A London Times news article, dated July 22, 1991, entitled, U.S. Drugs Sting Gave Pan Am Bomber Cover, noted that the DIA admitted that the protection program had existed. The explanation for this operation, which was codenamed Kura, was provided by Ronald Caffrey, acting assistant administrator of the operational division of the DIA. In a U.S. government submission, dated March 20, 1991, Caffrey said the drug operation was a controlled delivery. According to Caffrey, in a controlled delivery, a law enforcement agency permits and monitors shipments of contraband, including drugs, to move from a source or transit location to its intended destination. Use of this technique is sometimes essential to enable law enforcement agencies to identify and arrest high-ranking members of trafficking organizations, rather than simply arrest low-level couriers. Pan Am argued in court that it had been the pawn of an international intelligence operation, but still lost the case and was forced into bankruptcy. In 1990, when the White House started to woo Syria as a partner in the Allied coalition, blame for the Pan Am bombing suddenly shifted from Assad's Syria to Gaddafi's Libya, and that is pretty much where it stands today. Meanwhile, al-Qasr was alleged to have provided Oliver North with drug profits to purchase arms for the Nicaraguan Contras. The U.S. Tower Commission probe into Iran-Gate revealed that al-Qasr had been paid $1.2 million by Oliver North's co-conspirator General Richard Secord to move weapons from Israel to the Contras. In her book Octopus Surprise, former Reagan White House aide Barbara Honegger alleged that al-Qasr's heroin smuggling network in Italy was used to launder NATO arms stocks for diversion to Iran with the help of corrupt Italian intelligence officials linked to the secretive fascist Masonic Lodge, P2. It is noteworthy that al-Qasr was reported to hold large tracts of land in the Bekaa Valley. The PFLP-GC also has camps in the Bekaa which were the target of Israeli airstrikes in 1989. The U.S. government's presence in Lebanon is not to be taken lightly, according to Lester Coleman, a self-employed freelance writer, editor and security consultant who once moonlighted as a DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, Government intelligence officer when he was called to serve. Coleman, age 47, told the London Times that for 6 years he worked as an intelligence officer with the Secret Unit, Middle East Collection 10, MC-10, in Cyprus, running a network of agents in Beirut whose mission was to find American hostages held by extremists. Coleman was paid in travelers' checks sent from the Luxembourg branch of the now-collapsed Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. Two senior MC-10 members, Matthew Kevin Gannon and Major Charles Dennis McKee, had been on Pan Am Flight 103 and had just returned from a mission in Beirut. Coleman explained that the DIA, with the narcotics squad of the Cypriot National Police, the German BKA Police and British Customs, ran a drug sting operation through Cyprus and airports in Europe, including Frankfurt. The operation involved delivering heroin from the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon to the United States. The operation was codenamed Kura. Coleman maintained that Pan Am Flight 103 was being used by the DIA as a controlled delivery flight. After the explosion, the Beirut end of MC-10 had obviously been blown. There were 5 key members of the MC-10 cell in Cyprus and Beirut, one of whom was Lester Coleman. Another was Werner Toniusma, a German Lebanese, who was killed in a bomb explosion at his office in East Beirut on May 26, 1988. Another member of MC-10 was Charlie Freesley, a Lebanese army officer, who was shot dead at his home in East Beirut in November 1989. When Isma was killed, the DIA ordered Coleman home. Danny Casolaro had contacted Coleman in Sweden on August 3, 1991. 7 days before his death in Martinsburg, West Virginia. They talked about the sale of the Promise software by the U.S. government to foreign governments, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, and the Iran-Contra scandal. After Coleman learned of Danny's death on August 10, 1991, he provided INS Law President Bill Hamilton with an affidavit in October 1991. That affidavit read as follows. Affidavit of Lester K. Coleman, being duly sworn, do hereby state as follows. 1. I am currently self-employed as a freelance writer, editor, and security consultant. I am a United States citizen and am temporarily outside of the United States. 2. In November 1984, the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, offered me a position in human intelligence operations in the Middle East. I was raised in the Middle East, where I lived in Iran, Libya and Saudi Arabia. I speak 3 dialects of Arabic and some Farsi. I accepted the position and received training from the DIA. I was assigned to a Middle East intelligence unit. 3. Between February and September 1987, I was seconded by DIA to the Drug Enforcement Administration, DIA, in Nicosia, Cyprus, reporting to the DIA country attaché, Michael T. Hurley. 4. After a cover assignment in the United States, I was again seconded to the DIA in Nicosia, Cyprus, in early 1988. 5. During April and May 1988, I worked in the office of Urumi Trading Company, Limited in Nicosia, Cyprus, a DIA proprietary company. On or about May 29, 1988, because of my concern about poor security in the DIA operation in Cyprus, I returned to the United States, having previously obtained the concurrence of DIA. 6. During my 2 stints as a DIA-covered intelligence officer seconded to the DIA in Nicosia, Cyprus, I became aware of the fact that DIA was using its proprietary company, Urumi Trading Company, Limited, to sell computer software called Promise or Promise to the drug abuse control agencies of various countries in the Middle East, including Cyprus, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait and Turkey. 7. I personally witnessed the unpacking at the Nicosia, Cyprus, police force narcotics squad of boxes containing reels of computer tapes and computer hardware. The boxes bore the name and red logo of a Canadian corporation with the words Promise or Promise Am Limited in the company name. 8. The DIA objective in inducing the implementation of this computerized Promise system in the drug abuse control agencies of the Middle East countries was to augment the drug control resources available to the United States government by making it possible for the United States government to access sensitive drug control law enforcement and intelligence files of these Middle East governments. 9. It is also my understanding that third-party funds were generally made available for the purchase of these computer software and hardware systems. One third-party funding source was the United Nations Fund for Drug Abuse Control in Vienna, Austria. 10. As Dear Country Attaché for Cyprus, Michael T. Hurley had overall responsibility for both the Urumi Trading Company, Limited and its initiative to sell PROMIZ computer systems to Middle East countries for drug abuse control. 11. In 1990, DEA reassigned Hurley to a DEA intelligence position in Washington state. 12. I became aware in 1991 that Michael Riconosciuto, known to me as a longtime CIA asset, was arrested in Washington state by DEA for the manufacturing of illegal chemical drugs. I had also become aware of the fact that Riconosciuto had made a sworn statement, prior to his arrest, about his participation in a covert U.S. intelligence initiative to sell NonLethal's promised software to foreign governments. 13. In light of Hurley's personal involvement in the U.S. government's covert intelligence initiative to sell PROMIZ software to foreign governments and his reassignment to a DEA intelligence position in Washington state in advance of the DEA's arrest of Riconosciuto, the arrest of Riconosciuto should be regarded as suspect. I do not believe that Hurley's posting to a drug intelligence position in Washington state in advance of Riconosciuto's arrest on drug charges is merely coincidental. Rather, the probability is that Hurley was reassigned to Washington state to manufacture a case against Riconosciuto in order to prevent Riconosciuto from becoming a credible witness about the U.S. government's covert sale of the PROMIZ software to foreign governments. 14. The investigative journalist Danny Casolaro contacted me in Europe on August 3, 1991. Mr. Casolaro had leads and hard information about things that I know about, including Department of Justice groups operating overseas, the sale of PROMIZ software by the U.S. government to foreign governments, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, and the Iran-Contra scandal. I subsequently learned of Mr. Casolaro's death in Martinsburg, West Virginia, 1 week later, on August 10, 1991. I contacted NonLethal in October 1991. After learning about Mr. Casolaro's death under suspicious circumstances. Chapter 9. Village Voice magazine ran an article entitled, The Last Days of Danny Casolaro, by James Ridgway and Doug Vaughan on October 15, 1991, which gave a brief profile of Michael Riconosciuto's background. The 44-year-old Riconosciuto is, to put it mildly, a colorful character, wilder than anything in The Falcon and the Snowman. He was a gifted child. When he was just 10 years old, Michael wired his parents' neighborhood with a working, private telephone system that undercut Bell. In the 8th grade, he won a science fair with a model for a three-dimensional sonar system. By the time he was a teenager, he had won so many science fairs with exhibits of laser technology that he was invited to be a summer research assistant at Stanford's University, prestigious Cooper Vapor Laser Laboratory. Dr. Arthur Schillow, a Nobel laureate, remembered him. You don't forget a 16-year-old youngster who shows up with his own argon laser, he told Casolaro. Bobby Riconosciuto lived with Michael Riconosciuto at the time of his arrest in Washington state. Immediately upon learning of his arrest, she had fled to California with her 4 children, the youngest of which, Elizabeth, had been fathered by Michael. Bobby was well situated in an exclusive suite at the Embassy Suites Hotel in Orange County, California. Her suite contained a living room and bar overlooking lush indoor tropical gardens and water fountains, marble walkways over bridge-covered ponds, and a gazebo where free breakfasts were cooked and served to order. Within the room, she had at her disposal office equipment, phones in every room, answering machines, room service, and anything else she needed for herself and her children. Patrick Moriarty, Marshall Riconosciuto's business partner of 40 years, was paying the bills. Moriarty and the Riconosciutos, father and son, had once owned Hercules Research Corporation together in Hercules, California. An old Contra Costa County newspaper article, dating back to April 1981, gave the story of Hercules. The subheading of the article pretty much said it all: device could make Hercules a Silicon Valley. In 1981, Hercules had developed a small electronic power supply the size of a tissue box, designed to specifically feed 30,000 volts of electricity to another device, a MEC, modular energy transfer catalyzer, unit, that would cut the heating and cooling time in food processing and of making glass, metal and other products by 40%. The MEC unit, patented by Interprobe of Chicago, worked by electrostatically exciting air molecules by moving them through a charged field. This removed a boundary layer of molecules that inhibited the exchange of thermal energy. Hercules' high-voltage power supply was essential to the application of Interprobe's MEC unit, so both companies were in the process of working out a merger in order to market both technologies as a complete system. Admiral Henry Rankin, vice president of Interprobe, was a longtime family friend, and was very enthusiastic about incorporating the Hercules power pack with Interprobe's high-voltage electrostatic technology. Patrick Moriarty and Marshall Riconosciuto had funded research for 15 years and spent about $1 million of their own money on the project. By 1983, things were not looking so good for Patrick Moriarty. The Los Angeles Times newspaper reported in a series of articles that fireworks magnate W. Patrick Moriarty, his business and associates spent nearly $500,000 in the last 3 years to influence government decisions throughout California. Moriarty's relationships with several key state legislators and his campaign contributions to elected officials from Anaheim to Sacramento had made him a powerful force in state and local politics. His association with the notorious Robert Ferranti, head of Consolidated Savings and Loan, which failed in 1985, and who was the subject of a disorganized, on-again off-again FBI investigation, was written up in the book, Inside Job, by Mary Freak. Patrick Moriarty was described as the manufacturer of Red Devil fireworks, who founded the Bank of Irvine. The bank failed in 1984, the victim of fraud and mismanagement, according to regulators. In 1985, Moriarty pleaded guilty to mail fraud in a case that became the biggest political scandal in California in 30 years. Over 10 prominent politicians, including one state senator, were indicted for taking bribes from Moriarty. Though I'd spoken with her on the phone numerous times, I first met Bobby Riconosciuto face-to-face on January 15, 1992. On the day I visited her hotel suite, I hauled my meter copy machine on a cart up to her room and we talked and made copies of documents all morning. Bobby was young, buxom and attractive in a natural, Mother Earth sort of way. Her long blonde hair hung loosely around her shoulders, she wore no makeup, and her nose and mouth had an impish upturn that made her appear to be smiling even when she was not. We became friends as the day progressed. Bobby confided that some of the more sensitive material was stored at Michael's hidden trailer in Trona, California. While working at Wackenhut, Michael had anticipated a future need to have a hiding place for himself and his files in the event that things got out of control. Bobby, who had met Michael in Washington state after he left Wackenhut, had been instructed by Michael to stay away from the trailer in case she was being surveillanced. The files and computer equipment stored there were Michael's last ace in the hole. Nevertheless, Bobby was frustrated by the slow progress of Michael's court defense, by R.J.'s lack of response to Michael's request for witness protection, and she had been barraged by reporters who wanted documented proof of Michael's statements. I offered to drive her out to Trona, near Death Valley, to retrieve Michael's files and ultimately, she acquiesced. We arrived at the isolated trailer at dusk and began sorting through documents that could substantiate Michael's claim that he worked for the government. The electricity had been shut off and as it became dark, we were forced to use flashlights. Bobby was terrified that we might get caught in that godforsaken place. The children were cold and tired, and from sheer exhaustion, She finally offered to turn all the boxes and documents over to me to make copies at home. We threw everything helter-skelter into large plastic trash bags, dumped the bags into my Chevy van, and quickly headed back to civilization. It is noteworthy that before we left, Bobby pointed the flashlight towards another, smaller trailer situated on a knoll overlooking the road, which she claimed contained Michael's hidden computer equipment. It was several weeks before Michael learned that Bobby had turned the documents over to me. She never told him, nor did I. It was through Jonathan Littman, a San Francisco Chronicle reporter whom I had confided in, that Riconosciuto learned of our secret. Upon arriving home from my trip to the desert, I had Xeroxed round the clock for 5 days with help from trusted friends. The documents corroborated everything Michael had related over the phone, and more. It was an exciting time. Boxes and boxes of documents provided me for the first time with a window into the CIA corporate structure, arms deals, drug operations, money laundering, biological technology, all the connecting tentacles of Danny Casolaro's Octopus. After making copies, I squeezed the originals into 8 large packing boxes, sealed them tightly, and sent them back to Bobby Riconosciuto, via a friend, who gave them to Michael's father, Marshall Riconosciuto. I later learned Marshall allegedly shipped them to Ian Stewart Spiro for safekeeping. It was not until April 1993 that I learned what became of Spiro and the documents. An Associated Press news story entitled, "Deaths Linked to Spy Network," published in the Merce-Sunstar newspaper, outlined the death of Ian Stewart Spiro, 46, who was found dead of cyanide poisoning in the Anza Borrego Desert on November 8, 1992, 1 week after his wife and children were found shot to death in their Rancho Santa Fe home. The news story, originating from the Oceanside Blade Citizen, noted that documents and U.S. intelligence sources implicated Spiro in the Iran-Contra arms for hostages affair and an alleged Justice Department conspiracy to pirate software from a private company and sell it to foreign intelligence agencies. Spiro's name also appeared in Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North's personal notebooks documenting the Iran-Contra affair, according to the National Security Archives in Washington, D.C. Former hostage David Jacobson told the Blade Citizen shortly after Spiro's death that Spiro helped negotiate the release of hostages in the Middle East. After obtaining a copy of a follow-up Blade Citizen article dated June 3, 1993, entitled, "Spiro Probers Want to Talk to North" by Wade Booth, Stacey Fens and Michael Williams, I learned that Ian Spiro lived in Beirut, Lebanon during the 1970s and 1980s, where he made contacts with Lebanese religious leaders and the Islamic Jihad. Greg Quarton, Spiro's brother-in-law, told reporters at the Blade Citizen that Spiro maintained communication with Lebanese business associates until the time of his death, but investigating officers had possession of Spiro's phone bills, and as of this writing, they had not released them. San Diego Sheriff's Captain Jim Marmack said detectives were investigating allegations by Spiro's relatives that his file cabinets and business papers were missing. The week of the Spiro family's death, Robert Corson, a business associate of Spiro's indicted in a savings and loan scam, was found dead in an El Paso, Texas, motel room. Corson, who reportedly worked for the CIA, died of a heart attack, officials said. The Blade Citizen reported that Corson once carried money to South America in a deal to deliver covert weapons. Corson also allegedly associated with California investor Wayne Reeder, who was seen at a Wackenhut-Contra meeting in Riverside County, see Chapter 10. The newspaper article went on to say that Alan Michael May, age 50, a former Northern California field director in Richard Nixon's presidential campaign and attorney for Nixon's brothers Donald and Edward, was found dead in his San Francisco home on June 19, 1991, 4 days after a newspaper story in the Napa Sentinel outlined his role in an alleged plot by Republican Party officials to bribe Iranian officials to delay the release of U.S. hostages until after President Reagan's inauguration. Immediately after May's death, Raymond Lavers, Ted Gunderson's former forensics expert, and a former protege of Robert Mui, according to Michael Riconosciuto, wrote a letter to one of Michael's friends, expressing his professional opinion about the death of Michael May. A copy of that letter was faxed to me and the following excerpts quickly captured my attention. I don't understand why it's going to take 2 weeks to determine May's cause of death. Did you know that certain chemical assassination methods will have been evaporated out of the body by that time? Then, the cause of death would be ruled as natural, since the chemical agents are the primary cause that result in a secondary action such as heart failure, kidney or liver damage, etc. Some examples of these agents include BZ2, ricin, tropatoxin, shellfish toxin, and a variety of methylamine-based neurotoxins that affect the central nervous system and cause failure of one or more organs in the human body. Some, if not most of these toxins are solvent-based, DMSO, and may be introduced in minute quantities through the skin. Their effect may vary, and some toxins take weeks to months to take effect. Others take moments to damage the nervous system, then evaporate within hours. Unless the body is immediately refrigerated, the toxins are quickly evaporated, leaving only 1 or 2 parts per million in quantity. Unless there are suspicious circumstances surrounding the death, a trained forensic expert would never detect any traces of the toxin. So there you have it. Michael May is dead and they are dragging their asses to find out how. What is next? A statement that May died of natural causes? Let me predict this now. And we'll see. Regards, Ray. Michael May also apparently attended briefings connected with Lawrence Livermore Labs in California, according to an official listing of Lawrence Livermore employees at a briefings and discussions document obtained from Riconosciuto's files. The document, stamped, "Official Use Only," listed Edward Teller along with 9 other names, including Michael May, under the heading Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. Other headings with names listed underneath included the Department of Energy, Department of State, Defense Nuclear Agency, and Naval Research Laboratory. There were no other pages accompanying the document, so it was impossible to determine from what manual it came from. May's name also popped up in a letter Michael Riconosciuto wrote to Dr. John Philip Nichols at the Cabazon Indian Reservation when he was being screened for security clearances to work on the Cabazon, Wackenhut joint venture. The letter focused primarily on Al Holbert, an Israeli intelligence officer who allegedly recruited Riconosciuto into the CIA, and May's name was mentioned only once, in connection with members of the company. That one sentence read as follows: Ben Corker's relationship with Holbert and May will give the proper authorities the necessary auspices to come in and swiftly clean it, the company, up. Other portions of the letter gave a history of Riconosciuto's experience with Al Holbert. Excerpts. My problems stemmed from my association with Al C. Holbert. I first met Holbert when I was still in high school, and I was led to believe that he was an unofficial representative of the Israeli government. I was further led to believe that his interests were not contrary to those of the United States. It was not until July of 1981 that I learned the truth about Holbert. It came directly from him to me personally in what I will call a confrontational situation. August of 1981 was when I first brought Holbert to your, Dr. John Nichols, attention. At that time, I still did not know much, and I was still in a sort of state of shock from my new awareness of Holbert. I was in deep with this guy, and so was Paul Maraska. At first Paul thought that I was off base and overreacting, and then by degrees he started to come around. Much of the incredible account of Paul's doings, money transfers, gems, weapons, drugs, were the result of his relationship to Bert and Jensen. Bert, Jensen and Corker all met Paul through his brother Joe. I was the one who introduced Al Holbert to Paul, and Paul was the one who introduced me to Bert, Jensen and Corker. This was in early 1967. I was introduced to Al Holbert through the Stanford crowd at the home of, name withheld, in Portola Valley, California. Interesting enough, name withheld, is a former State Department employee. The realization of who and what Holbert is, and Paul's death, have taken me some time to adjust to. And that required professional help. I now have a clear idea and good perspective on what has really happened in my life. I am in awe of Holbert and his group's power, the company. During the last year, I have forced this structure to rear its ugly head in many different times and places, and in ways that can't be covered up. I have also spread far and wide what knowledge I have with the intent to first protect others involved and secondly to chisel the story in stone. Where it all stands now is that no matter who the group attempts to silence or what truths they attempt to perpetrate, the truth cannot be destroyed. This is now in the hands of a competent attorney. My direct involvement is finished except to be available to answer questions. I feel that Holbert and his group represent a current national security nightmare to this country. I feel that I have been extricated from the hold of this group. But I also feel that the destruction by legal means of this group ranks in importance with my scientific and engineering skills to the overall picture. Ben Corker's relationship with Holbert and May will give the proper authorities the necessary auspices to come in and swiftly clean it up. I would now like to start out where we should have been a year ago. The first point I will start with is a recap of our visit to Picatinny Arsenal. It is noteworthy that two of the people mentioned in the above letter are now dead, Paul Maraska and Michael May. The bizarre circumstances of Maraska's death are detailed in the next few pages. Ben Corker of the company is now serving time in prison for having 900 pounds of methamphetamine in his possession at time of arrest. Through one of Michael's contacts, I managed to locate the current, 1991, whereabouts of Al Holbert and confirm his identity. A letter written on Solomon Investigations letterhead, dated June 13, 1991, to a client requesting payment for the services of Holbert read as follows, excerpted. I enlisted the services of my electronic countermeasures expert, A.C. Holbert, for an immediate survey and sweep of the premises. Mr. Holbert is highly regarded as the best electronics man in the San Francisco Bay Area and has recently worked with Israeli intelligence services in the field of electronic countermeasures. He agreed to take on this job. I have enclosed a copy of Mr. Holbert's faxed report. The mystery of Al Holbert was further uncovered in a 1983 transcript in which Michael stated, after Paul's Maraska death, Holbert admitted to me that he was a Soviet-backed agent, and they had a home, or he had a home for me, and I could be treated like royalty, and he reiterated that offer in the latest meeting, and he said he was prepared to deliver some $500,000 cash to me as a show of good faith. The transcript, originating from a series of tape-recorded interviews between Michael Riconosciuto, Ted Gunderson and Robert Booth Nichols at Nichols' 007 apartment in Marina del Rey, provided a window into the entire drug scene in California from the early 1960s through the 1980s, mostly relating to methamphetamine operations in the Bay Area. It had been typed by Ellen Nichols, Robert's wife. Riconosciuto's relationship with Ted Gunderson dated back at least as far as 1982. Michael and Nichols dated back to 1967. In reading the transcript, it appeared that Gunderson and Nichols were interviewing Riconosciuto for recruitment into a drug sting operation. Riconosciuto later verified that he was, in fact, being recruited into the overseas Lebanon drug operation by Gunderson and Nichols because of his, Riconosciuto's, undercover experience in the drug trade. It is noteworthy that Al Holbert, the Israeli intelligence agent who originally recruited Michael into the CIA, is mentioned extensively throughout the 71-page transcript. Riconosciuto's relationship with Holbert had lasted from 1966 to 1981, a span of 15 years. Most of that time had been devoted to complex drug activities in California. In one passage, Riconosciuto stated that Ben Corker was one of Al Holbert's lieutenants. The other lieutenant with Corker was Charlie Weinberg, who set up the Vortex Chemical Company in Berkeley, California for Holbert. Holbert was also interested in technology. I really confided in him. I was constantly steering him to various people in the Silicon Valley, for requests that he made which were very sophisticated technical requests. In the transcript, Ted Gunderson asked Michael, Holbert had a technical mind for that sort of thing? Michael responded, absolutely. He had a firm grasp of physics, mathematics, chemistry, military hardware. Gunderson asked, let's go back to 66 to 81, you were close to him? Michael, not on a regular basis. He would get in contact with me when he needed consultation in certain areas. I made some good money. I designed communications equipment for them. I did a lot of software development. Ted, and then he gave it to the Israelis? Mike, yes. Ted, and he admitted this? Mike, oh yeah, none of it was really classified. I did software for the analysis of radar change data. It was based on mathematical models that the Department of Defense wasn't using, My approach was new and different from theirs, but it wasn't connected with any of their projects, so technically it wasn't classified. Michael developed other technology along the way and subsequently attracted the attention of Dr. John Philip Nichols at Wackenhut-Cabazon, who wanted his services. But Michael's association with Al Holbert was hindering Michael's security clearances. Through the screening process and Dr. John Nichols, Michael had learned more about Al Holbert. Ted, well, how could he, Holbert, be a Soviet agent and an Israeli agent? Mike, your guess is as good as mine. I talked to Major General Pruitt on that subject last May and he said, you don't understand the ways of the world. Regarding Al Holbert, I said, that man has done more damage to my generation and my country. Drugs. How can you people say that you're friends of the United States, when you send us a guy like that? Michael continued. Holbert came to the United States and he went to work for the Treasury Department out of Philadelphia and... Ted interrupted. In what way? As an agent? Mike, I don't know what the relationship was. The Treasury Department wouldn't tell me. They wouldn't comment at all except to acknowledge that, yes, he was involved at very high levels, giving special training. Holbert taught courses in interrogation techniques. He taught touch call techniques, with the thumbs on the temples and various scare areas like that. He moved around to a lot of different agencies. He got involved with the FBI, and he was involved with the drug enforcement people. Ted, he indicated to you for 15 years, that he was with the Israelis? Mike, Israelis. Yes. Ted, and then you realized through Dr. Nichols that he was a Soviet? Riconosciuto explained that he thought it was John Amaral at Wackenhut who had zeroed in on Holbert. Gunderson continued to press Riconosciuto about Holbert being a double agent. Michael responded, well, he was with the Soviets, but he was also with the Israelis. Holbert definitely is connected with Israeli intelligence. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, buts, or maybes. He was decorated in combat for them. Riconosciuto further recounted a visit to Israel in April 1982. He had met a man, name unspecified, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense of Israel for a number of years and was in charge of defense production for the Israeli government. This man was a friend of Ariel Sharon and he had introduced Riconosciuto to Sharon. It was through this man and a man named General Pruitt that Riconosciuto confirmed Holbert's position with the Israelis. Holbert definitely is one of their boys. I got an admission out of General Pruitt that Holbert was funny, that he's a Trotskyite, and they knew about it, and I couldn't understand why they kept a guy like that around. I was told that I just didn't understand the ways of the world. Ted asked, who does Holbert report to? Mike, Jean-Pierre Bonner. At this point in the transcript, Robert Booth Nichols interceded and provided Bonner's address. His address in Paris is 114 Champs-Élysées, Paris 8, France. That goes into my territory. Mike added, Jean-Pierre reports directly to Colonel Stefan Yuznansky of the Ukraine. Nichols noted, I have strict files on him. Ted asked, and is he GRU? Mike answered, no KGB. Nichols added, as high as you can go. Ted asked, and where is he? In the Kremlin. Mike answered, no, he's in Vienna. Nichols interjected, out of Salzburg. He has a home 20 minutes from Salzburg. His hobby is boar hunting. He has about a 20-man contingent. Gunderson asked, is Bonner a Canadian? Nichols responded, Bonner is French. Bonner was involved in the assassination attempt on de Gaulle. Bonner served time. Ted, he's KGB. Nichols, oh yeah, a colonel. Ted, okay, anything else? Anything more on Holbert that we should bring up? Riconosciuto noted that Holbert was very disappointed that he couldn't turn him, Riconosciuto, in August of 1981. Ted asked Michael if Holbert admitted at that time that he was KGB. Michael corrected Ted, GRU, he was GRU. He told me that he was GRU and he bragged that there were over 35,000 GRU agents active on the North American continent. And I checked with John Amaral and with Robert Fry, executives at Wackenhut Corporation, and they told me it was about half that number. He, Holbert, wanted me to leave the United States, through Canada, and go to Israel. Riconosciuto added, you know, he's touched the Central Intelligence Agency, the Treasury Department, the Secret Service and various local law enforcement agencies all over the country. The above-mentioned transcript was mailed by one of 3 people to the prosecutor at Michael Riconosciuto's trial in Washington state where it was entered into evidence. At that time, to Michael's knowledge, only Robert Booth Nichols, Peter Zokoski and Jonathan Littman, a San Francisco Chronicle reporter, had possession of it. I subsequently received a copy of it from Jonathan Littman, who coincidentally, I learned later, happened to be Ben Corker's cousin. Corker belonged to the company, according to Riconosciuto, and had been arrested with 900 pounds of methamphetamine in his possession. Littman had obtained the transcript from Peter Zokoski, Robert Booth Nichols' partner. Riconosciuto believed Littman had given the transcript to Corker during one of his visits with him at the Pleasanton prison, and Corker had sent it on to the prosecutor at Michael's trial. Nichols later confirmed to me that he, Nichols, had indeed interviewed Riconosciuto with Ted Gunderson in 1983 and the transcript was legitimate, though he wouldn't state the purpose of the interview. It is significant that a passage in the 1983 transcript mentioned Michael May as one of the top 3 guys in the Lawrence Livermore laboratory management structure who was associated with Riconosciuto. Michael and Bobby Riconosciuto had been communicating with Jonathan Littman for months, as had Danny Casolaro before his death, and they wanted me to connect with him. At that point, Littman had written a series of in-depth articles on the Cabazon Indians and Dr. John Nichols, and I hadn't been interested in talking to him until he wrote about the death of Michael's partner, Paul Maraska. The article, entitled, Bizarre Murders Puzzle Cops, published on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle on December 30, 1991, noted that the body of Paul Maraska, 31, had been found by Michael Riconosciuto. Maraska's arms had been lashed behind his back as he was hog-tied with a telephone cord from his curled-up legs to his neck. Police believed he died when his legs finally gave out and the cord tightened like a bowstring, drawing the noose around his neck until he slowly strangled. Before his death, Maraska and Riconosciuto had planned a business venture with Cabazon Administrator John Philip Nichols to develop high-technology military hardware. Maraska was also described as a San Francisco entrepreneur suspected of being a money launderer involved in a major Northern California drug ring. Oddly, when Riconosciuto found Maraska's body, he drove 500 miles to the Cabazon reservation and told John Nichols about the death. Nichols then called his Los Angeles attorney, who telephoned the San Francisco police. Just 3 days after Maraska's death, Mary Quick, a 63-year-old school teacher, was shot in the face and her purse stolen as she was about to enter Fresno's American Legion Post 509, where she was president of the Women's Auxiliary. At first, police assumed it to be a routine mugging murder, until it was discovered that her nephew, Brian Weiss, who had been living at his aunt's house in Fresno, was a business associate of Michael Riconosciuto's. Brian Weiss was also mentioned in the above-mentioned 1983 drug transcript. Riconosciuto explained to police that he told Paul Maraska that he had given Mary Quick a card containing secret bank account code numbers because she had no connection to any of the principals and could be trusted. She had been instructed to give the code numbers over the phone only to Paul Maraska or Michael Riconosciuto. It was not until I obtained Michael Riconosciuto's desert files that the above story affected me personally. Within one of the boxes was an envelope containing 8 coded computer cards with large sums of money handwritten next to the account numbers. One card, containing 10 account numbers, indicated sums of upwards of $3.5 million. That was just one card of 8. In my next conversation with Michael Riconosciuto, I inquired of him the real story behind Paul Maraska and Mary Quick's death. I did not reveal to him that I was in possession of his bank cards, but referred to their SF Chronicle newspaper story. Michael remorsefully indicated that he had not, in fact, given any cards to Mary Quick as he had told Paul Maraska he did. Michael had kept them, and obviously hidden them at his desert trailer. Nevertheless, Maraska believed, and under torture revealed, that one of the cards was being held by Mary Quick and the rest were stored in a safe deposit box. As we know, Mary Quick died 3 days later. After that conversation, I immediately took the cards to a professional photographer, had close-up photographs taken of them, and returned them in a separate envelope to Bobby Riconosciuto. I never knew what she did with them. During subsequent phone conversations, Riconosciuto often referred to his former partner, Paul Maraska. During his attempt to trade into the Federal Witness Protection Program, he had made a statement which caught my attention, and which I later inquired about. While relating his background in the electronics field, he had mentioned that he once worked at Timeshare, Incorporated. Chuck Everett, a longtime family friend, had reportedly been one of the founders along with Tom O'Rourke. Noted Riconosciuto. And at the time of Paul Maraska's death, the biggest loss I received was a big bag of bearer shares of original Timeshare stock. And that was the main reason why Paul got killed. Riconosciuto had stressed that only the Finson people would understand the significance of that. I later learned that the computer cards which Paul Maraska and Mary Quick had died for belonged to the Timeshares online financial clearinghouse used worldwide by banking institutions. Essentially, the cards were provided to a subscriber or user who rented time on the computer for conducting banking transactions. Riconosciuto chose not to elaborate on his operation of timeshares from a jail phone. Nevertheless, I was able to decipher that he and Paul Maraska had accessed bank accounts using the computer cards in conjunction with a password determined by the user. Michael had created the passwords from the pets named in Phyllis Riconosciuto's, Michael's ex-wife's, diary. He did, however, randomly discuss his background with timeshares. I developed the modem, error trapping routines for timeshare used on the original network. I developed the protected mode memory for the Scientific Data Systems, SDS, Sigma 7 computers. And I developed the Capital PERT software, which was the next generation of critical path method. That's a programmed evaluation review technique that Timeshares, for years, was a leader in. And then Electronic Data Systems bought a license from them, and EDS's story is legendary. Now, Promise is an outgrowth of PERT. The Hamiltons had a woman programmer who was self-taught, and she's the one. Her signature is in the code structures of Promise. It's just like her signature because she was out of the mainstream and did things her own way. Shortly thereafter, while reviewing Riconosciuto's documents, I came across a copy of an obscure statement submitted by Riconosciuto in February 1984 to the San Francisco grand jury on the death of Paul Marasca. It cryptically tied Marasca to Wackenhut and appeared to have been transcribed from a tape-recorded interview. The statement in its entirety read as follows. I first heard of Phil Porritt on December of the 1981. John Philip Nichols, Cabazon administrator, told Paul Marasca and myself that we needed Phil Porritt as a consultant to Recovery Technology, Incorporated. Porritt was represented by John P. Nichols as being able to smoothly handle metals transactions for RTI on a large scale. Phil Porritt was one of the contacts that John Philip Nichols had committed to arrange for Paul as part of our deal. Paul Marasca's body was found after he failed to contact Porritt for that scheduled meeting in January 1982. After Paul's death, JPN, John Philip Nichols, came to me with a request. He asked me if I could recover some of Ben Corker's LSD because he had a sale for £5 of it to someone in Romania. John Philip Nichols claimed that this was an authorized covert intelligence operation and the proceeds would be used to purchase George Wackenhut's yacht, Top Secret. Military electronics equipment to be delivered to South Africa was also to be purchased according to JPN and delivered by the yacht. I went along with the program because JPN told me that the agency was involved through WSI. I did some checking on my own and became suspicious of JPN. Then JPN met with myself and Raul Arana of Central Caribbean Research, Incorporated. At this meeting, the details were plainly discussed by Mr. Arana. At that point, JPN directed me to have Pat, Philip Arthur Thompson, recover all of Corker's assets. I then contacted De Silva, who had control of Corker's assets, and he agreed to release them to me. De Silva later called the Indian reservation and gave the location of the assets, which included one bobtail semi-truck with power lift gate loaded with amphetamine production chemicals, one red Datsun truck with a portable refrigerator containing the acid. I accompanied Pat and Steve Finley to the locations of these vehicles in the Oakland area. The keys, title and registration were with each vehicle. Pat and SF drove the vehicles off and I reported to JPN that the vehicles had been located and picked up. I also reported to my attorney, D.W. Don Wager, the details. I contacted JPN a few days later and he complained to me that Pat had made off with everything. With George Wackenhut in Las Vegas. JPN told me that my problems would be over with if I went along with the program. Brian Weiss, Mary Quick's nephew, drove me to Palm Springs where I rented a car. JPN, myself and Brian Weiss then drove to Las Vegas. We arrived in Las Vegas late in the afternoon. We checked into the hotel. After we checked in, I was then introduced to Phil Porritt by JPN. Porritt seemed a little nervous and upset with JPN. JPN seemed desperate to have Phil Porritt stall George W. on the sale of the yacht. Phil Porritt seemed reluctant to go along with JPN. JPN, myself and Porritt then went to a private section of the dining room and met with GW, George Wackenhut, and John Amaral. During dinner, JPN outlined my situation. Al, Holbert, Ben, Corker, Richard, Notzi, and the Fresno Company were covered in detail. A cutaway, sectioned high-security lock was also shown to GW, George Wackenhut. I said that this should be presented to his personal friend, Bud Miller, for action and that I would be contacted. The sale of the W.H. Wackenhut yacht then came up. Porritt gave GW a story, at JPN's prompting. GW was impatient and asked where the South African Thompson could be reached. I then asked GW, George Wackenhut, if he was referring to Pat, Philip Arthur Thompson, and he said, yes. I then demanded to know what was going on. I laid out to GW what Pat had done, including murdering PM, Paul Maraska. JPN interrupted me and told GW that I was mistaken and it was a different PT that I was talking about. It was at that point that GW, George Wackenhut, said he had a hearing problem and the dinner broke up. I went immediately to make telephone calls. I spread the word that I felt my life was in danger and that JPN, WH, and Pat had conspired to kill PM, Paul Maraska. I then went back to the dining area where I saw PP, Phil Porritt, and GW, George Wackenhut, at a small Octopus table talking about the yacht deal. JP and I were standing up and they asked me to come to A's room. At A's room, everybody acted like nothing had happened. We talked for an hour or so about hyped projects. JP and I then went to PP's room and talked about P's meeting with Paul M., Bill Jensen, Bert Gardner and metal projects. We then went to bed. The next morning JPN, BW, Brian Weiss, and I drove back to Indio. At no time did JPN mention the problem that came down at dinner. In John Connolly's SPY magazine article on Wackenhut, September 1992 issue, on page 54, a brief notation mentioned Riconosciuto's meeting in Las Vegas with George Wackenhut and John Amaral, a Wackenhut board member and consultant to George Wackenhut. SPY contacted Amaral regarding the meeting, and Amaral confirmed that such a meeting did indeed take place in Las Vegas. I don't remember any specific conversations, Amaral said, but I think we were there to discuss the sale of George's, Wackenhut, yacht, the top secret. I think Nichols said he had a potential buyer. Wrote SPY, so, the wealthy president of a large security company with CIA ties and one of his board members meet with a drug dealer turned electronics expert and a spook turned arms supplier and all they discuss is the sale of a boat? After reading the newspaper article on the death of Paul Maraska, I contacted Jonathan Littman at the San Francisco Chronicle. Littman jumped in the car and drove from San Francisco to Mariposa, near Yosemite National Park, when he learned I had obtained Michael's hidden documents. Interestingly, when he arrived at my home he thumbed through piles of documents, but seemed to be looking for something specific. I later learned he was searching for Phyllis Riconosciuto's, Michael's first wife's, diary. While Michael had worked at Wackenhut, Phyllis had been treated psychiatrically by the Cabazon administrator, Dr. John Philip Nichols. Part of her treatment included writing a diary of her life with Michael. Michael later broke into Nichols' office at the reservation and stole the original diary before fleeing to Washington state. The original diary was in fact included in the documents I had obtained in the desert, but I decided to withhold specific pages from Littman until I could determine what his purpose for wanting them was. An incident which I have enumerated in Chapter 10, confirmed that my instincts had been subliminally correct. Meanwhile, I attempted to satisfy Littman with a few documents sent to me by Henry Weinstein, court reporter for the Los Angeles Times. I had contacted Weinstein to inquire if he had written anything on Robert Booth Nichols, unrelated to Dr. John Philip Nichols' lawsuit against the Los Angeles FBI, specifically FBI agent Thomas Gates. Weinstein had not heard of the lawsuit, but immediately investigated at the Los Angeles courthouse. Shortly thereafter, he sent a package of documents relating not only to Nichols' lawsuit against Thomas Gates, but also relative to Nichols' corporate minutes on the facilitation of biological technology to Japanese institutes, copies of his weapons permits, and documents indicating that Eugene Giaquinto, vice president of MCA Entertainment Division, was on the board of directors of Nichols Corporation, Meridian International Logistics. Marvin Rudnick, now a Pasadena lawyer, once tried to prosecute MCA Corporation for organized crime involvement, but got shut down at the highest level, and the organized crime strike force was disbanded. One member of that investigative team was Richard Stavine, who talked to Danny Casolaro shortly before his death. Eugene Giaquinto and Jack Valenti played heavily in Rudnick's investigation of MCA, as did Curry Company, a subsidiary of MCA, in Yosemite National Park. Rudnick was written up in American Lawyer for his explorations through the MCA labyrinth, and at some point, worked closely with Thomas Gates during his investigation of Robert Nichols. Gates and Weinstein were also well acquainted with Mariposa County government's relationship with Curry Company. See page 2 of manuscript. In return for sharing copies of these documents with him, I asked Littman to collaborate with me on a story concerning the government-sanctioned, 10 years, methamphetamine operations at Whiskey Flats, on the Sarah Priest Indian Reservation in Mariposa. I was still intent on forcing the arrest of deputies involved in the meth lab at that location. See page 3 of manuscript. Littman instructed me to put together a detailed synopsis which he would submit to the San Francisco Chronicle. Chapter 10. Through Michael Riconosciuto, Danny Casolaro had compiled a sizable list of former CIA officers and arms dealers, the most noteworthy of whom was Robert Booth Nichols, described in various publications as a James Bond type who jetted around the world trading arms and other products. At the time of Danny's investigation, Nichols headed Meridian International Logistics, MIL, a California-based company that conducted extensive business in Australia and Japan. MIL also controlled Meridian Arms Corporation, of which Riconosciuto was briefly vice president. Out of the Wackenhut-Cabazon endeavor grew a business partnership between Nichols and Riconosciuto, both interested in developing new, high-tech submachine guns and powerful explosive devices that, like a nuclear blast, could produce an electric magnetic pulse that could wipe out an enemy's communicators and electronics. The secretive Nichols chatted with Casolaro frequently. Casolaro's July phone bills indicated that he called Nichols 15 times that month, often in the wee hours of the morning. Several of those phone conversations lasted for more than 2 hours. Before his death on August 10, Danny Casolaro told his brother, Tony, and Bill Hamilton that Nichols warned him that his investigations were risky. According to FBI statements, Nichols is not a man whose warnings should be taken lightly. In September 1987, Special Agent Thomas Gates of the Los Angeles FBI had begun an investigation of the activities of Robert Booth Nichols and his corporation, Meridian International Logistics, through Japanese and Australian legal attachés abroad. According to a subsequent deposition filed by Gates, the Bureau suspected Nichols of being involved in a $500 million stock fraud and of maintaining ties to the Gambino crime family and organized crime in Japan. Gates's deposition was part of a 1987 wiretapping on the phone of Eugene Giaquinto, an official of the MCA Entertainment Corporation with reputed mob links. Nichols was one of the people whose calls the Bureau intercepted. According to the wiretap application, Nichols was allegedly an international money launderer for money generated through narcotics trafficking and organized crime activities. In June 1989, Nichols sued Thomas Gates in a California state court for libel, slander, and interference with contractual relationships when he, Gates, allegedly acted outside the scope of his employment by initiating contacts with the Australian Federal Police and various individuals in Australia and Japan. The complaint asked for damages in the amount of $11 million. Ted Gunderson submitted an affidavit on Nichols' behalf, stating that he believed Gates had acted outside the scope of his employment when investigating Nichols abroad. The suit was subsequently dismissed through the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Robert Booth Nichols was depicted in one Eastern publication as a handsome, dashing figure, frequently described as Clark Gable without the ears. His friendship with movie actor Steven Seagal brought him a cameo appearance in the movie, Under Siege, but his real purpose for being on the set was to act as technical advisor for the weaponry used in the movie. The son of a prominent Los Angeles surgeon, Nichols is the inventor of a submachine pistol that he maintained was superior to the MAC-10. Nichols' weapons permit application, dated January 28, 1985 from the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department, indicated that he was born on March 6, 1943 at Loma Linda, California. In addition to his residences in California, he maintained residences in Italy, France, Australia and London, England for business purposes for 20 years. His medical doctor was listed in Zurich, Switzerland. He had worked for Harold Okamoto in Hawaii for 4 years, from 1968 to 1972 as vice president of Preventer Security Center, an intruder electronics firm. The 4 guns registered to him included 2 Colt .45 automatics. His purpose for carrying a concealed weapon was listed as such: I am involved in the research and development of weapons systems, ranging from the basic blowback automatic weapon to various advanced destructive devices. As I have detailed knowledge of the workings of these systems, I feel it is imperative to have personal protection for myself and for the good of the community. Nichols Corporation, Meridian Arms, a subsidiary of Meridian International Logistics, was licensed in California in 1987 to possess and/or transport machine guns, permit number 01678, and to sell machine guns, permit number 01677. A 1985 statement by Domestic Stock Corporation filed with the Secretary of State in Sacramento listed Harold Okamoto, Peter Zokoski, and Glenn Shockley as directors in addition to Nichols' family. Okamoto, Zokoski and Shockley are also listed as directors on Meridian International Logistics, Incorporated, MIL. Eugene F. Giaquinto, president of MCA, Music Corporation of America, Home Entertainment Division in Universal City, was also a director of MIL until May 31, 1988, when he resigned and returned his 10,000 shares of stock as a result of the Los Angeles Organized Crime Task Force investigation, at that time headed by Thomas Gates. The May 25, 1988 minutes of an MIL board meeting reflected Robert Booth Nichols' concern with the investigation. Upon meeting with Agent Gates on March 8, 1988, our legal counsel, Judge Mark Robinson, interpreted the line of questioning of Agent Gates as having a main focus on the relationship between Robert Nichols and MCA, Incorporated, of which Mr. Giaquinto is an officer. Therefore, due to Mr. Nichols' concern, which Mr. Giaquinto understood and thus stated he would submit written a resignation within 2 days, it was the unanimous decision of the board to remove Mr. Giaquinto from the position of director of MIL forthwith. Nichols' concern with such an investigation can well be justified when you review the minutes of an MIL board meeting held in Sherman Oaks on August 26, 1988. The following business was discussed and voted upon, excerpted. It was the unanimous decision of the board to draft a letter to the president of an internationally recognized medical school in Japan, as referenced in our corporate minutes of April 24, 1988, with regard to our corporation's intention to make available a grant of funds to said school, as the funds become available to our corporation, and under specific terms and conditions. The phenomenal success in the field of immunotherapeutics by the immunology department of said Japanese medical school has convinced the board of MIL that the exclusive training of qualified physicians under contract to and the direction of Meridian International Logistics, Incorporated, would be of great value and benefit to our company and its shareholders. While reading these documents, I couldn't help wondering why an arms dealer, allegedly tied in with organized crime, wanted to fund the exclusive training of physicians at a Japanese medical school. The minutes of MIL dated September 20, 1988, referred to an agreement executed on September 14, which discussed the three-way, equal ownership between MIL, Dr. Shigeyoshi Fujimoto, and Ajinomoto Company Incorporated, of certain patented biological technology identified as a newly devised technology for induction and activation of cytotoxic lymphocytes, cells, referred to as CTL, directed to autologous cancer cells in vitro with high efficacy utilizing a serum-free medium. A power of attorney was issued to attorney Fujio Kubota in Japan to file patents and registrations on the technology entitled the Method for Induction and Activation of Cytotoxic Lymphocytes. The signatories on the agreement to file registrations and patents on September 14, 1988 were listed as Dr. Shigeyoshi Fujimoto, Takashimimi, Ajinomoto Co., Incorporated, Hitoshi Onogi, representative of MIL, Kanehiro Ishida, International Service Center, Incorporated, and Takashi Kimikawa, American Embassy. Hitoshi Onogi was granted full power of attorney to negotiate and execute an equity position for Meridian International logistics related to the filings and any other documentation pertaining to the technical knowledge in the mechanical and/or chemical processes for the production of T cells as are present in the immune system of the human body or any other organism. In and of itself this transaction seemed innocuous enough. But again I asked myself, why was an international arms dealer on the board of FIDCO First Intercontinental Development Corporation, a CIA-front corporation, which offered $3 billion to rebuild Beirut to President Amin Gamal of Lebanon, whose chief of finances, Sami El-Khoury, was shipping tons of heroin to Sicily for re-export to America, want to invest in a method for induction and activation of cytotoxic lymphocytes? Was this technology being developed with the authority of the U.S. government, or independently? If Nichols' operations were in fact government-sanctioned, then it must have been frustrating for him to be investigated by the FBI. The concept of the FBI inadvertently investigating the CIA was ironic. And what had Danny Casolaro learned about this technology? I found a possible answer in an obscure letter written on Wackenhut-Cabazon letterhead, dated January 20, 1983, addressed to Dr. Harry Fair at Tactical Technology in Arlington, Virginia, from Dr. John P. Nichols, Cabazon administrator. The letter noted that on February 15, 1983, Dr. Nichols would be forwarding to Dr. Fair a unique list of agents and production techniques related to biological warfare. The letter went on to say that the Stormont Laboratories business plan Dr. Nichols mailed to him was to prepare him for what was to be sent in the area of biological warfare. Added Dr. Nichols, these products could be utilized in small countries bordering Albania or large countries bordering the Soviet Union. You will be amazed at the scope. I could not help recalling the Village Voice article, The Last Days of Danny Casolaro, October 15, 1991, which had stated, tongue-in-cheek, that Casolaro had traced the Inslaw and related stories back to a CIA old boy network that had begun working together in the 1950s around the Albania covert operations. The hybridoma technology discussed in attached documents, in Michael Riconosciuto's files, centered around the ability to reorganize and synthesize genetic structures and to modify lymphocytes, immune cells. Under the heading Possible Military Applications Utilizing Hybridoma Technology was the notation that gene splicing technology provides the ability to produce pathogenic, harmful agents, that is viruses. In fact, noted the writer, biological warfare weaponry of this nature, both production and supply, is limited only by the imagination of the scientist. Included in the above-mentioned documents, attached to the Dr. Harry Fair letter, was a proposal to develop monoclonal antibody kits to detect the presence of such harmful biological agents in a field, combat, environment. In other words, develop a laboratory-created vaccine for a laboratory-created virus. The very same proposal had been submitted to Peter Zokoski in December 1982 by John P. Nichols. I wondered, was this the same technology that Robert Booth Nichols and the directors of MIL, including Peter Zokoski, Glenn Shockley and Harold Okamoto, were fronting to the Japanese? What kind of weapon was this? Other weapons discussed in the same letter included the Cabazon Arms California 9 SMG, which Peter Zokoski had the British interested in. The California 9 SMG could be produced for $75 per unit on the reservation and sold for $100 to $125. It meets all the needs of a small, poor democracy for 9 per BM, said Nichols. They can afford to purchase this one. We have fired over 50,000 rounds with a test model using South Korean ammunition without jamming. We could begin manufacturing within 2 weeks in a country like Guatemala, Chile, etc., utilizing USA-produced dies and Swedish extrusion machinery. Peter Zokoski has fired both the Viper and the California 9 SMG and was impressed with both, but particularly with the California 9 SMG. Kuwait has been particularly interested in financing the production of the California 9 SMG. Dr. Nichols concluded, "We would initially manufacture on the reservation. We can purchase an existing small company with all the licenses to manufacture and export. Meridian Arms? We are ready. We are continuing to experiment with the combination sniper rifle, 9, equipped with micro-precision enhancement. No tubes, night vision." Michael Riconosciuto and some friends of the reservation have been working cooperatively on this project. Within another 90 to 120 days we should have a working model to use on the California 9 SMG and the sniper rifle. The ongoing projects listed in research and development were a second 9-caliber machine pistol, an assault rifle with laser sighting, a long-distance sniper rifle, and a small portable rocket system which could be attached to the assault rifle. 3 months later, on April 13, 1983, Robert Booth Nichols wrote to Joseph Losnick in Madison, Wisconsin, recapitulating exactly the same weapons proposal as outlined above by Dr. John Nichols to Dr. Harry Fair. I never found out who Joseph Losnick was, but Dr. Harry Fair's name popped up in a Wackenhut inter-office memorandum in Michael's files. Dated May 25, 1981, from Robert Fry, a vice president of Wackenhut in Indio, to Robert Chasen, a vice president of Wackenhut in Coral Gables, and former commissioner of U.S. Customs. The memorandum detailed a May 12-13 visit to Dr. Harry Fair, chief of propulsion technology, Applied Sciences Division and others at Picatinny Arsenal in Dover, New Jersey. The arsenal was listed under the official heading of U.S. Army Armament Research and Development Command, Large Caliber Weapon Systems Laboratory or ARIDCOM. The 5-page memo not only outlined the depth of Wackenhut's commitment and involvement at the Cabazon Reservation, but it delineated Peter Zokoski's importance to the projects underway there. One of those projects included proposed construction of an R&D, research and development, facility on the Cabazon Indian Reservation for the manufacture of 120 mm combustible cartridge cases for sale to the U.S. Army, with sales also to NATO, and especially to the Federal Republic of Germany, which at that time was adopting the use of such cases in their Leopard tanks. Wrote Fry, "The obvious key to any such endeavor is Peter Zokoski. He is reportedly one of only 67 personnel in the world who have had any significant experience in the development and manufacture of the slurry process involved in combustible cartridge cases. He is under present non-compete agreement with Armtec, his former company, until August 1981. Armtec is the present sole source supplier of 120 mm combustible cartridge cases to the U.S. government. Zokoski is also serving as a consultant to the British government. It is noteworthy that the Cabazon Indians had enlisted the aid of other Indian tribes to join in their endeavor. Use of adjacent tribal lands as a location for a large-caliber weapons range test site was obtained from a sister tribe, the Torres Martinez, involving some 30,000 acres of very remote and desolate land near the Salton Sea. Potential use of a test firing range for the railgun on the Santa Rosa Mountain, under the control of the Santa Rosa Indians, had also been pledged to the Cabazons and the U.S. government. A notation was included in the lengthy memorandum to firm up the deal between the joint venture and John Vanderwicker, president of Intersect Corporation, in Irvine, California, who had the exclusive rights for foreign marketing with the Litton electron tube division in third world countries. Mention of John Vanderwicker in the Wackenhut memorandum was singularly important in my investigative leap from overt arms operations to covert intelligence operations. According to Peter Zokoski, Vanderwicker was on the CIA payroll. In Riconosciuto's files, I located a letter dated April 11, 1983, written to Vanderwicker at Intersect Corporation from Glenn Shockley, a board director of both FIDCO First Intercontinental Development Corporation, and MIL, Meridian International Logistics, under investigation for organized crime activities. Robert Booth Nichols was also on the board of both corporations. The Octopus trail gets a little complicated here, but it is a significant trail. Both Vanderwicker and Shockley were on the CIA payroll. Documents to that effect will be noted in future pages. In the aforementioned letter, Shockley was offering to Vanderwicker 42 H-1S Cobra helicopters at a unit price of $7,800,000 each. The rest of the letter read as follows. Note a few words had been damaged while xeroxing. The price offered is FAS location at seller's option Europe. The price is net to buyer possessing the proper documentation and does not include any government considerations, taxes, if any, all of which, indecipherable, to the buyer's account. For verification of the existence of these products, you are requested to refer to telex transmission occurring during the spring of 1981 between Union Bank Suisse of Zurich, Switzerland, and Omega Industries of Long Island, New York. The transmissions were addressed to Mr. Pavislavi at Omega and were signed by Mr. N.A. Indecipherable, bank officer. Your immediate response to this offer would be greatly appreciated. Sincerely, Glenn R. Shockley. Attached to this letter was a handwritten memorandum, obviously taken from the above-referenced telex transmission. The memo delineated the procedure for airframe ID number acquisition. The buyer's bank officer was instructed to telephone seller's bank officer at 8 a.m. Tuesday morning to relay the following seller's bank data: Bank Credit Suisse, Geneva. Officer Mr. Common. Telephone number 011412236530. Account number 027465905481. Reference code JH. If the connection was missed, then it was to be repeated Wednesday at 8 a.m. $10 million US dollars was to be exchanged at the bank for a frame ID no. On Wednesday. If all was ready to proceed in Geneva in 5 banking days, then the $10 million would be credited to the buyer's account towards acquisition of all craft. If not, then $10 million was to be forfeited. The bank officer's follow-up monologue as noted on the memorandum read as follows: acting on behalf of our client, I confirm that he has on deposit the sum of $10 million USD upon receipt of one airframe identification number. The price of one craft will be set aside irrevocably for your client. If our client does not present to you within 5 banking days in Geneva, Switzerland, all necessary data, documents and fund commitments, he has agreed to forfeit the price of one craft to your client's account. Also attached to these documents was a sheet of handwritten notes obviously related to the above transaction. The names of various banks and their locations, along with the name of a bank officer, notations about metric tons of gold, and a code name, Messenger Boy, were cryptically scrawled on the sheet. I inquired of Michael Riconosciuto what the story was on the sale of the Cobra helicopters. Riconosciuto briefly related the following story. The 42 Cobra helicopters had been ordered for NATO, then after the helicopters were built, the funding was not available. Nichols and Glenn Shockley, working for the CIA, were contracted to get rid of the helicopters. John Vanderwicker was brought into the operation and the helicopters were shipped to a warehouse in Europe, destined for North Korea, then Iraq. It is important to note here that North Korea was a conduit for arms to Iraq from both the United States and the Soviet Union. In essence, the United States was forced to compete with the Soviets in providing arms to Iraq. This is discussed in further chapters, but in summary, what it all boiled down to was Oliver North supplied arms to Iran. The CIA supplied arms to Iraq. And Wackenhut supplied arms to the Contras. All under the authority and supervision of the US government. I asked Michael Riconosciuto if Danny Casolaro had knowledge of the helicopter deal. Michael responded, I gave him the names of the people that were involved and Danny went out and confirmed it. I asked him to elaborate. Well, Danny went and talked to Roy Fermark, Phonetic SP, William Casey's ex-right-hand man, and Fermark admitted that he had contact with them, the helicopters. And when the NATO stuff disappeared, Bob, Nichols, disappeared with it. They weren't going to pay Bob and his accomplices what they wanted, per the original deal, and Bob got angry and just walked away with it all. But Bob got help from some people in the White House, and they cut a certain group of guys in the agency, CIA, out. I asked, who was involved with the helicopter sale besides Nichols? Well, Glenn Shockley, Pavoslavi, Phonetic SP, he's an Iranian, but he worked with the Israeli, indecipherable word, mission out of New York. Riconosciuto paused, remembering, then continued with his story. I brought in Stan Singer, former deputy Israeli defense minister, to try and take all those helicopters off everybody's hands. I would have made a nice, tidy sum of money for myself. Who were the helicopters originally destined for? Mike, NATO. During the Carter administration, there was a slip-up on some funding. They were really screwy in the way they handled certain things. Was this some kind of an undercover operation? Mike, it was on the up and up, regular deliveries from the United States to NATO, but there was some kind of a misunderstanding between the upper reaches of the Carter administration and some of the other NATO countries, so while they were having high-level discussions, no financial instruments exchanged hands. They finally came to terms on the financial end of it, but by that time the stuff, helicopters, had been removed from the loading docks and warehouses. So, they were gone? Mike, they were gone. To North Korea. Mike, into storage in Europe. Later they got sold to North Korea, and other places. It was hotter than hell. Where in Europe, do you know? Mike, well, I don't want to go into it on the phone, from jail, but I know the whole story behind it. While it was in storage, everybody and their brother was trying to buy the stuff and the price got jacked way up. Casey's faction and Carlucci and those guys, they wanted it all, wanted to screw Bob and his guys, and Bob made an alliance with somebody else for the stuff. Who? Well, later with Mike McManus in the White House. McManus was assistant to President Reagan, and on the board of directors of FIDCO with Nichols. Why did they call upon Nichols to do this? What was his connection? Mike, Bob had been doing errands for them for years. Who in particular? Mike, Bob was working under Larry Kern basically. And Ellen's father, Nichols' wife, was somewhere in there. Was he working for the NSC at that time? Mike, just the CIA. He was just doing contract-type work. He was good at what he did. Whatever objectives were given to him, Bob always achieved them. You know, he has an impeccable track record. In a subsequent interview with Robert Booth Nichols, I asked him about the helicopter deal. Nichols confirmed that he had, indeed, participated in the shipment of the helicopters to Europe through the CIA. In news interviews, Wackenhut had denied association with Michael Riconosciuto, yet on Michael's files, I found a letter written on Meridian Arms letterhead, dated February 10, 1984, from Robert Booth Nichols to Dr. Harry Fair, referring to the Wackenhut visit to Picatinny Arsenal in May 1981. Nichols reminded Dr. Fair of the demonstration at Picatinny in which Michael Riconosciuto had discussed electrostatic heat transfer augmentation in a wide range of applications, and demonstrated control of heating electric discharge. This letter was significant in that it confirmed that Riconosciuto had in fact accompanied Peter Zokoski and Robert Fry, vice president of Wackenhut, to the Picatinny Arsenal to demonstrate the above-mentioned technology. The crux of the Wackenhut involvement in arms development and shipments through various sources, including Peter Zokoski, Robert Booth Nichols, John Vanderwerker, and others, was tied irrevocably to the Reagan administration's efforts to aid the Nicaraguan Contras. A special operations report emanating from the Riverside, California, District Attorney's Office, which was sent to Johnny Cohen, investigator for the House Judiciary Committee on Inslaw, provided indisputable proof that Wackenhut sold arms to the Contras. The Special Operations Intelligence Report entitled Nicaraguans and Earl Bryan at Lake Keller, 9 October 1981, described a meeting held between two groups, the Nicaraguans and Wackenhut-Cabazon officials, at a county police firing range at Lake Keller in Riverside County. According to the surveillance report, the purpose of the meeting was to test a new night vision device and weapons. All the weapons tested were semi-automatic. A new sniper rifle tested was a .50 caliber with a 308 bullet. The report went on to note that some automatic weapons were present, but all had necessary permits through Meridian Arms. Meridian Arms is owned by Michael Riconosciuto, Robert Booth Nichols, no relation to John Philip Nichols, and Don Oliver, former undersheriff of San Diego County. Meeting and testing took about 1 hour, then all parties left. Police officers had been placed around the surrounding area in a surveillance, protection type mode. Each of the 6 Indio police officers participating in the range surveillance were named individually in the report. The license plate numbers of each car that arrived on the scene was included in the report, along with the names and identification of everyone who attended the demonstration. Some of those names and IDs were: Michael Riconosciuto, researcher for Cabazon Indians; Peter Zokoski, president of Armtech Coachella; John D. Vanderwerker and a couple of his friends. Vanderwerker, CIA research director for CIA for 8 years; Earl Bryan, Wisconsin businessman and CIA employee; 2 Nicaraguan generals, Eden Pastora, Commander Zero, and Jose Cordell, Commander Alpha. Raul Arana, Central Caribbean Research Procurement Front for Liberation of Nicaragua, pre-Contra days; John Philip Nichols, Cabazon Indian manager; Wayne Reeder, builder, developer; Jimmy Hughes, security chief, Cabazon Indians; Art Welmes, tribal chairman of Cabazon Indians; Scott Wesley, United States Army; Honduran Telephone Company, military connection network in Southern Hemisphere, and others. The surveillance report indicated that Wayne Reeder and Earl Bryan arrived together in a 1981 white Rolls-Royce, license plate number OK2XG 2302. The 2 Nicaraguan generals arrived in a 1981 Honda, license plate number as of May 877. A newspaper article in the Los Angeles Times, dated May 16, 1991, entitled Noriega Papers claims CIA sent him millions, by Mike Clary, reported that General Manuel Noriega, Panama's former strongman leader, was paid more than $11 million from a CIA/fund. A 107-page Noriega defense document contended that Noriega once warned the CIA to put an end to cocaine shipments to the United States that were being used to raise funds for the Contras in Nicaragua. Noriega, who was scheduled to go on trial for drug smuggling on July 22, maintained that planes carrying arms to Nicaraguan rebels returned to the United States loaded with illegal drugs. It was clearly a guns for drugs policy, he said. The article concluded that Noriega served as a conduit for cash payments from the CIA to one-time anti-Sandinista leader Eden Pastora. So, in 1981, Eden Pastora attended the Wackenhut night vision goggles demonstration in India with numerous CIA employees in attendance, and 10 years later, the LA Times reported that Pastora was a recipient of cash payments, via Noriega, from the CIA. I believe it is safe to theorize at this point that the various tentacles of the octopus heretofore outlined were used to develop and ship arms to various countries such as Nicaragua, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Pakistan, and other third world countries in exchange for cocaine and heroin. These countries certainly didn't have the funds to pay with cash. And it is possible that the company was in fact the mechanism used to distribute the drugs after entry into the United States. The reader may be wondering how I obtained a copy of the above-mentioned Special Operations, Surveillance, report. I had requested a copy of it from both the Riverside District Attorney's Office and John Cohen, investigator for the House Judiciary Committee on Inslaw, but the report was confidential and neither would send me a copy. I then called Peter Zokoski and asked him to corroborate the report's existence. He not only corroborated it, but he offered to send me a copy. When I asked how he had obtained a copy, he said, "I asked a friend in Washington, D.C. to go into the House Judiciary vault and make a copy for me." I received a copy shortly thereafter from Peter Zokoski. When I called John Cohen and mentioned I'd obtain a copy, he said he was aware that someone had gotten past the guards and into the House vault. He didn't know what had been taken, but he validated the document in my possession. Chapter 11. Michael Riconosciuto had some, if not all, of the answers to the gene splicing technology that Zokoski and Wackenhut had attempted to sell to the Army Weapons Division in 1983, and later fronted to the Japanese, through Meridian International Logistics, in 1988. I felt that time was of the essence in uncovering the nature of this technology, so I pushed Riconosciuto to talk about it. It looks like Earl Bryan, Sir Dennis Kendall, Hercules Research, Wackenhut, Zokoski and Bob Nichols were all involved in the same biotechnological agenda. Michael answered, "You got it." I asked, "Are they connected, or are they all individually working on their own projects?" Michael, "Yes." "How?" Michael, "Check out Biorad Laboratories. Their international headquarters are on half of the property that used to be the Hercules plant, in Hercules, California. Do you understand what I'm saying? Biorad makes the most toxic biological and radioactive compounds known to man. And they're now located in the town of Hercules. Biorad Industrial Park. That building of theirs, the headquarters, doesn't look like much, but it goes 20 stories down into the ground. It's a huge underground complex. See, Biorad was the flagship company, and then they, Earl Bryan, started Infotech, and then they got mired in lawsuits, and then Hadron was formed to be a cut-out parent corporation, you know, just to be a firewall from lawsuits. I asked, "What do they do at Biorad?" "Well, they make the most hazardous biological and nuclear chemicals in the world, for medical research." "Who do they sell it to?" "Well, frontline researchers all over the world. Biorad is the single source for this stuff. Actually, Aldrich Chemical sells it. There's about 100 companies, but Biorad is head and shoulder above all of them by a factor of 10 on many things like cytotoxins." I remembered reading about cytotoxins in the Wackenhut-Cabazon biological warfare letters to Dr. Harry Fair. Michael continued, "You look at cytotoxic lymphocytes. You go ask any medical professional what they're doing on the leading edge of research there, what the full implications to humanity are, okay?" I wanted clarification from Michael, so I answered, "It looks to me like research on a cure for cancer." Michael took the bait. "Go ask a professional. I'd rather have you hear it from a collateral source other than from me." "Well, give me some indication." Michael responded hesitantly, "It would have been Hitler's wet dream. It's selective to such a degree that it's awesome. With the appropriate genetic material, you can wipe out whole segments of humanity. There's no stopping it." I asked, "You mean you could selectively wipe out certain races of people?" "Sure. Geez," Mike continued. "And, also, from the beneficial side, you can very specifically wipe out disease cells, cancer cells. Look at the patents. Look at Immunix, Phonetic SP Corporation. Look at the patent portfolios on Biorad." "Who's Biorad's main buyer?" "Well, the National Institute of Health. You know, every hospital in the world buys Biorad products." I had read about Sir Dennis Kendall, the famous M16 British intelligence officer during World War II, in Who's Who in America, 1989 issue. Kendall had worked with Michael in some, as yet, undefined capacity. Bobby Riconosciuto had noted to me that Kendall and Ted Gunderson had counseled Oliver North prior to his testimony to Congress. Kendall was also heavily involved in arms and biotechnology, according to Michael Riconosciuto. Who's Who described Dennis William Kendall as a medical electronic equipment company executive, born in Halifax, Yorkshire, England on May 27, 1903. Kendall came to the United States in 1923, was naturalized in 1957. His background included being a consultant to the Pentagon on high-velocity small arms from 1940 to 1945. He was listed on Churchill's War Cabinet gun board from 194,145. He was later Executive Vice President of Brunswick Ordnance Plant in New Jersey from 1952 to 1956. From 1961 to 1973, became President of Dynapower Midonics in Los Angeles, and Chief Executive of Kendall Medical International, Incorporated in Los Angeles in 1973. In 1983, the same year that Wackenhut was offering biological warfare agents to the Army, Sir Dennis Kendall was the chairman of Stern Products, Incorporated. His club membership listings indicated he was a 32-degree shrinner in the Pacific Palisades, California, Masons, and a member of the Religious Society of Friends, Quaker, amongst other things. I asked Riconosciuto, what was Sir Dennis Kendall's connection? Michael broke in. He's involved in all of it. You might be able to get a handle on Kendall through Tiny Roland, a subsidiary of which is Penguin Books. And the other good old boy in the nail work is Octave Bonner. Then there's Wolfgang Fozog, Phonetic SP, Rene Hanna, Count Otto Linke, Phonetic SP. How did you meet these guys? I was introduced through Joe Snell and Norman Davis. Snell was considered the father of industrial design. He was an industrial design artist who did the logos for Coca-Cola, Chanel No. 5, Life magazine. Norm Davis owned Unintelligible Brewery until he sold to Carling. My dad was his advertising and public relations man. My dad didn't know Kendall personally, but Norm Davis did. I met Kendall through Davis. Do you know what Kendall is into currently? Sure. What would that be? There's a pharmaceutical company in Los Angeles. There's a medical electronics company. Ted Shannon in Los Angeles supervises all the production for that stuff. It's very exotic, far-out stuff. And he's still in a controlling position in Brunswick Ordnance Corporation. I asked Riconosciuto, how close was Biorad to your father's plant, Hercules? Mike answered, it's on the same property. Mike, when you were conducting research at Hercules, you were incubating something in fish tanks. What was it? Michael's response had a nervous edge to it. Where are you getting this? Riconosciuto was unaware at that point that his hidden files were in my possession. I'm just thumbing through some old documents. Those documents aren't supposed to exist anymore. They've all been destroyed. By whom? Well, it was a matter of routine, you know. They couldn't exist. That's what they're doing with all this stock manipulation, you know. The biologicals are what got them in the door at such a high level in Japan. I sensed Riconosciuto's possible involvement in the project, his reluctance to discuss it. But he believed I had all the records and he stammered on. That paperwork trail shouldn't exist. I mean, it was kept in a safe place, and then it was shredded. And the only people that had any direct knowledge of it was Peter Zokoski and Earl Barber, John Nichols, Bob Nichols, you know, those people. Michael was attempting to disengage himself from any responsibility for the research. If there are any records left, those are their records, not any of ours, at Hercules, because I'm sure all of ours were destroyed. I asked, why did you destroy them? Well, do you understand the nature of this technology? You're talking in vague, general terms. I answered, I have an idea. Michael interjected. Horrible things. You know, it makes what the Nazis did to the Jews look mild. The Romanian project. Do your homework on that project, you know it's a horrible germ warfare project. And the Soviets were involved in it, and we countered it with our own methods. I noted to Michael that Bill Turner, the man who had met Danny Casolaro in the parking lot of the Sheraton Martinsburg Inn, with Hughes aircraft documents, on the day before his death, was currently in jail. Turner had written a letter in which he talked about an Iraqi from the Iraqi embassy who was facilitating the transportation of biological warfare items to Iraq. Michael responded, listen, Saddam Hussein introduced chemical and biological warfare agents to all his top military leaders. And he became enamored with this technology. He's been on a binge of sorts. Even when he was in the secret police of Iraq, he used chemical means on a wide scale. I asked, but none of those various entities that I've just named were dealing directly with Iraq, were they? No, not directly. All they needed was a vendor's list. Riconosciuto noted that the shipments were all at our international trafficking of armaments, regulated chemicals, electronics, communications equipment, anything that was on the ATAR list. In August 1991, the Financial Post ran a story on Dr. Earl Bryan. At that time, Bryan's main company, Infotechnology Incorporated of New York, was bankrupt, and its subsidiary United Press International, UPI, was on the verge of collapse. According to the Financial Post, the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI were investigating Bryan, and a flurry of affidavits filed in the Inslaw Incorporated scandal accused him of selling bootleg copies of the computer company's cash tracking software, Promise, to the intelligence services of Canada, Israel, and Iraq. Bryan was referred to as Cash in the intelligence community and reportedly had a close relationship with the CIA. He was a highly decorated combat surgeon in the Vietnam War in the late 1960s. Allegedly working in the controversial Phoenix program. This, according to a 1993 Wired premiere issue, entitled Inslaw, The Inslaw Octopus by Richard L. Fricker. Wrote Fricker, after a stint in Vietnam, where he, Bryan, worked as a combat physician in the unit that supplied air support for Operation Phoenix, Bryan returned to California. In 1970, Ronald Reagan appointed Bryan director of the California Department of Healthcare Services. He was only 27 and destined to remain a part of Reagan's inner sanctum. U.S. and Israeli intelligence sources linked Bryan's name to the sale of weapons to Iran in the 1980s. He was serving U.S. intelligence people, said Ara Ben-Menash, a former Israeli intelligence officer who claims he met Bryan several times. Once in Tel Aviv. Bryan allegedly had more to do with the financial end of the transactions. Other publications listed Bryan's holdings in the rapidly developing biotechnology field. The high-tech empire of Dr. Bryan was a grab bag of fledgling companies involved in all the hot areas: lasers, cancer detection kits, blood testing products, genetic engineering, computer programs, telecommunications and investment databases. One of Bryan's companies, Hadron, Incorporated of Fairfax, Virginia, which, incidentally, both Michael Riconosciuto and Robert Nichols maintained Peter V. Denieks was involved in, was a laser manufacturer and computer services company. According to Bill Hamilton, president of Inslaw, Hadron had attempted to buy Inslaw in 1983. Dominic Leahy, Hadron's chairman at the time, had phoned Hamilton out of the blue and said Hadron intended to become a dominant vendor of software to law enforcement agencies. Would Hamilton like to sell? Hamilton demurred. "We have ways of making you sell," Leahy is said to have replied. Leahy, in an interview in 1988 with the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations, said he didn't remember calling Hamilton. Nevertheless, Hamilton said he believes his rejection of Hadron on that day in 1983 triggered an attempt by the Department of Justice to put Inslaw out of business, or at least bankrupt the small, Washington-based software maker. At that time, Peter V. Denieks was the administrator of the contract between Inslaw and the Dodge. Within a few months of Hadron's call, the Department of Justice, citing contract violations, stopped making payments on Inslaw's $10 million deal to install Promise software in its 20 largest U.S. attorneys' offices nationwide. Promise stands for Prosecutors Management Information System. Inslaw, starved of cash, was forced into Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in 1985. Hamilton sued the Dodge for theft of property in 1986. In February 1988, federal bankruptcy court judge George Basin ordered the Dodge to pay Inslaw $7 million in licensing and legal fees. The Dodge, Basin ruled, had stolen Promise from Inslaw through trickery, fraud and deceit, then tried to put the company out of business. The Dodge appealed Basin's ruling, but it was upheld. However, in May, the U.S. Court of Appeals reversed the decision on a technicality. Hamilton believed Dr. Bryan and his old crony, former Attorney General Edwin Meese, were behind the attempt to bankrupt and liquidate Inslaw. When Inslaw refused to sell to Hadron, Hamilton believed the Dodge tried to bankrupt and liquidate Inslaw to force the sale of its assets, perhaps to Hadron, at fire sale prices. Several journalistic publications accused Dr. Bryan of profiting from the Justice Department's theft of the Promise software. According to a number of sources, Bryan traveled the world during the mid-80s, selling the data management program to intelligence and law enforcement agencies the world over. Bryan's role, if any, in the October surprise was less well publicized. The primary source thus far for the allegations that Bryan was involved is former Israeli intelligence officer Ara Ben Menash. Menash alleged that Earl Bryan helped make one of the first contacts between Republicans and the government of Iran in 1980. Ben Menash claimed Bryan accompanied Robert C. Bud McFarlane to Tehran in late February 1980. The trip came shortly after the New Hampshire primary, when insiders knew that there would be a Reagan-Bush ticket. Earl Bryan and McFarlane, then an aide to Senator John Tower, RTX, allegedly contacted Iranians with whom Bryan had conducted business prior to the fall of the Shah. According to Ben Menash, one of these was Mehdi Bazagan, one-time prime minister, and in February 1980 still closely connected to the Iranian leadership. An old 1975 Sacramento Bee newspaper article, dated January 12, 1975, reported that Earl Bryan, called the genius doctor by his friends, was out to get a little of that Middle Eastern oil money. The article went on to say that Bryan was helping to write a proposal on health care for Iran. Bryan, then at the University of Southern California, was working with Samuel Tibbetts of the California Lutheran Hospital Association, which in turn was working with the Chicago Group. The Chicago Group was not named and details of the proposal were not known. It is significant that Bryan left his post 1 year before this proposal was written, in 1974, as Governor Ronald Reagan's Health and Welfare Secretary. It was not known whether the contract with the Iranian government was ever consummated. Another interesting facet of Bryan's background included his relationship with Senator Terry Sanford, DN.C. Prior to his election, Sanford had been the attorney representing Earl Bryan in his 1985 takeover bid for United Press International, UPI. Sanford was also instrumental in winning Bryan an appointment to the board of Duke University Medical School. At that time, Sanford was the president of Duke University. Dr. Bryan ultimately directed his energies towards biological technology. Another of his companies, Biotech Capital Corporation of New York, became 50% owner of American Cytogenetics, which was planning in 1982 to create a subsidiary to engage in genetic research. One notable investor in biotech, when it went public in 1981, was Edwin Meese. Today, American Cytogenetics in North Hollywood, California, conducts pap tests for cervical cancer. It also tests tissue samples for cancer and related diseases. Sales in 1985 were $3.4 million. Hadron, of which Dr. Bryan was a director, provided engineering and computer consulting services, along with telecommunications products. Sales were $25.7 million in 1985. Clinical Sciences, Incorporated sells biochemical products used for diagnostic tests and antibody analysis. Dr. Bryan was also a director of this company. Sales in 1986 were about $4 million. Michael Riconosciuto had stated that he believed Earl Bryan held a financial interest in Bio-Rad Laboratories in Hercules, California. I was unable to locate Bryan's name in board directories, but obtained some documents on an OEM agreement between California Integrated Diagnostics, Incorporated, a wholly owned subsidiary of the Infergene Company, manufacturer, a Delaware corporation, and Bio-Rad Laboratories, Incorporated, customer, a Delaware corporation, which listed the terms under which the manufacturer would provide the customer with various products. Various exhibits outlined the product price list, delivery schedules, engineering specifications, etc. What made this agreement significant was a newspaper article published in the San Francisco Chronicle on May 31, 1991, entitled, "SF Firm Faces Toxic Charges." A criminal complaint had been filed against a law firm, an investment banking house and several lawyers and financiers involved with Infergene Company for abandoning its toxic wastes after filing for bankruptcy. According to an affidavit filed by the Solano County District Attorney's Office at the Fairfield Municipal Court, after Infergene was evicted from the premises, a county inspector found several hundred containers including petri dishes and vials marked chlamydia, herpes, and HSV2. Many others contain bacteria of unknown etiology. A Vacaville newspaper reported that on December 7, an environmental health inspector found 36 55-gallon drums of radioactive butanol containing beef mucosa. They were improperly stored and lacked labels showing content, hazard warning or the owner's business address. A follow-up report made by the Environmental Health Office noted that a Halloween 1990 investigation into a smell was traced to a door with a radiation warning on it. The department had recommended that the lab doors be sealed and the pipe opening sealed. In all, the county environmental health department had responded 4 times to complaints about smells from the Infergene labs in the Benicia Industrial Park well before it shut down in February. One complaint listed persistent smells causing nausea, a problem also cited by others still working in the area. Founded in 1983, Infergene specialized in DNA technology, making diagnostic test kits for AIDS, hepatitis and other diseases. My research led me to another article on Bay Area biolabs. In June 1991, the San Francisco Examiner published a story entitled, "Germ Lab Alarms Berkeley," which noted the community of West Berkeley was home to the Defense Department's one and only supplier of anti-plague vaccine. On December 28, 1990, 4 maintenance men made an unauthorized entrance into a room at Qatar Biological which housed Yersinia pestis, commonly known as the Black Plague, which once killed a quarter of the population of Europe 650 years ago. There was no harm to the workers and no release of the live bacteria, but if an accident had occurred, all of Berkeley would have been wiped out. It is impossible not to compare the two incidents in the San Francisco Bay Area with the Wackenhut proposal to develop biological warfare viruses on the Cabazon Indian Reservation in Indio, California. In order to develop vaccines, which sounds innocuous enough, the virus must first be created. In the case of biological warfare viruses, the disease would have to be highly sophisticated indeed, if it were to be used in military applications. Certainly nothing that would be easily recognizable, if it escaped the laboratory, to a layman medical doctor in Indio, California, or for that matter at any Indian reservation in the United States. Any type of biological research on an Indian reservation would not be subject to scrutiny by the federal government because Indian reservations are sovereign nations. Nevertheless, if a virus did escape a secret government installation at an Indian reservation, the reservation would provide an ideally isolated environment for further study, by a government entity, of affected subjects or victims under quarantine. Not a very pretty picture. Yet this was the exact nature of the proposal by Wackenhut to Dr. Harry Fair of the Army Weapons Division. For the first time, I began to notice various mysterious illnesses cropping up in the media. I'm sure there have been unidentified diseases throughout history, but for the first time, I was conscious of what was written about them. The first to capture my attention was the sudden deaths of 12 Navajo Indians in New Mexico and Arizona. A June 3, 1993, Department of Health Services Inter-Office Memorandum distributed to public health laboratory directors throughout California labeled the virus a mystery illness in New Mexico and Arizona. The memo asked, "Is it in California too?" On June 2, 1993, New Mexico officials had reported a total of 19 cases, summarized as follows: of the 19 cases, 12 were Native American Indians. 12 died. All of the victims were residents within a 100-mile area in northwest New Mexico and northeast Arizona. The symptoms included fulminant respiratory distress which killed within hours. There was no identifiable cause. This was printed in capital letters. Under etiology, origin, the memorandum noted, the illness remains a mystery despite extensive testing at University of New Mexico Hospital, New Mexico Department of Health, and CDC. If etiology were plague, anthrax, tularemia, some cases should have been identified by cultures, stains. Oddly, nationwide media printed stories stating that the illnesses were caused by rat droppings, yet the actual documents from the Department of Health Services in Berkeley, California, confidentially given to me by a laboratory director in June 1993, mentioned nothing about rat droppings. I later read about the mystery illness in Time magazine, November 22, 1993 issue entitled, The Gulf Gas Mystery, which reported that American troops in the Persian Gulf, upon returning home, were complaining of chronic diarrhea, aches in all the joints, and difficulty breathing. Several veterans and their families testified before a congressional committee that the Defense Department had ignored their complaints, and the Veterans Affairs Department downplayed the affair. The veterans themselves were convinced they had been exposed to disease-causing chemical agents while in the Persian Gulf. 8,000 veterans registered their symptoms with the U.S. government, thus labeling the disease Gulf War Syndrome, GWS. Ultimately, the disease was determined by Major General Ronald Blank, commander of the Walter Reed Army Medical Center, to be multiple chemical sensitivity syndrome. A board of inquiry was created, headed by Joshua Lederberg of Rockefeller University, a Nobel Prize-winning expert on rare and emerging diseases. But, noted Time, it is up to the Pentagon to bridge the credibility gap that seems to have sprouted over the strange new syndrome. It was not until 1996 that the Pentagon admitted GWS may have been caused by exposure to bomb chemical, biological plants in Iraq. By far the most provocative incident occurred in February 1994. The Spokesman Review, out of Spokane, Washington, printed a story on August 9, 1994, entitled, "Victim of Mysterious Fume Seeks Investigative Reports." In Riverside, California, the county in which the Cabazon Indian, Wackenhut facility is located, Dr. Julie Gorczynski, an emergency room doctor, was overcome by mysterious fumes while examining a woman who later died. "This is a bona fide, genuine medical mystery, and we intend to solve it," said Russell S. Gussman, attorney for Dr. Gorczynski. Gorczynski suffered from osteonecrosis, avascular necrosis of bone, post-traumatic stress disorder, shortness of breath, restrictive lung disease and other ailments, as a result of exposure to the dying cancer patient on February 19. Coincidentally, her symptoms matched those of GWS. Later, in the same newspaper, dated September 3, 1994, another article emerged regarding the Riverside mishap. The bizarre episode had sent 6 emergency room workers to hospitals after being exposed to fumes emitting from patient Gloria Ramirez's blood samples drawn on February 19, 1994. According to the state's 15-page report, 11 people reported smelling an unusual odor after blood was drawn from Ramirez. After 5 collapsed and the emergency room was evacuated, 23 people complained of at least one symptom, most commonly headache, dizziness, and nausea. More serious complaints included muscle spasms and breathing disruptions. Despite extensive epidemiologic, toxicologic and environmental investigations, the cause of the outbreak of symptoms among emergency room staff members remains unknown, the report concluded. Dr. Gorczynski's lawyer stated that it could only be a toxin. "It's physically impossible for Julie to have had the symptoms, and not just the symptoms, the laboratory findings and test results that showed. Clearly Dr. Gorczynski was poisoned that day." But epidemiology experts could find no culprit to explain the bizarre episode. The Department of Health Services ultimately described the incident as an outbreak of mass sociogenic illness, perhaps triggered by an odor. I could not help wondering if the deceased Gloria Ramirez was an Indian, or had ever been on the Cabazon reservation in Indio. I later learned she had been receiving experimental cancer treatment at a clinic in Mexico. J.M., Ted Gunderson's live-in partner, on more than one occasion had noted that she held in her possession a photograph of Gunderson and Sir Dennis Kendall, the British MI6 officer who owned biolabs in Los Angeles, standing in front of a Mexican cancer clinic. According to J.M., the photo had been used in an advertisement seeking nurses to work at the clinic. Without a copy of the photo, I was unable to determine if it might be the same clinic which Gloria Ramirez attended prior to her death. In February 1993, I was contacted by a U.S. Customs agent who was conducting an inquiry into the Holmslaw, Peter Wiedeniuk's Wackenhut affair. The man had flown into California from back east to interview Mike and Bobby Riconosciuto and other witnesses associated with the Inslaw case. Someone, whom he would not identify, advised him to contact me. On February 5, he and his partner drove to my home in Mariposa and spent the day. I provided him with an affidavit relative to Riconosciuto's attempted trade into the Witness Protection Program. The affidavit contained mostly drug-related information on the company and Robert Booth Nichols' connection to Michael Abel, Dodge, and the Cali cartel. The agent also obtained a tape-recorded statement, under oath, relative to my findings and left with an armload of documents. 2 years later, in 1995, Abel was indicted for money laundering for the Cali cartel and drug-related charges. He called frequently after that. 1993, once from a phone booth in the dead of night after visiting Langley, Virginia. We subsequently struck up an investigative collaboration of sorts. On September 3, 1993, I received a call from him in Palm City, Florida. He had interviewed Robert Chasen, former Executive Vice President, Systems and Services Group, of Wackenhut Corporation in Coral Gables. Chasen, 70, was still senior consultant at the Florida facility, but was allegedly dying of cancer and weighed less than 100 pounds at the time of the interview. Because he, Chasen, had once been Commissioner of Customs in Washington, D.C., he felt a rapport with this young agent and spoke candidly about his experience with Wackenhut in Indio. Of significance was Chasen's confirmation of the horrendous properties of the virus which he encountered at the Indio facility. He said, Wackenhut was running amok. Robert Nichols and Peter Zokoski had attempted to sell the biological warfare technology, developed in cauterizers, through Wackenhut, using Robert Fry, vice president of the Indio facility, as the front man. According to Chasen, Fry went behind Chasen's back in facilitating the project. When Chasen learned of the project, he shut it down. Chasen supervised the Indio facility from Coral Gables, Florida. Because of the projects underway at the Cabazon Reservation, Chasen chose not to step foot on the property, but instead met with the Indio executives in Palm Springs. In other respects, Chasen was not so candid. Though the customs agent said Chasen said a lot of derogatory things about Wackenhut in Indio, he did not admit to knowing Peter Wiedenieks. The agent's investigation had led him to believe that the Promise software was stolen, and Wiedenieks was involved in the theft, but he did not have enough evidence to take his case to court. Chasen was evasive on the subject of Promise, though his background would indicate that he must have been knowledgeable about it. He had been a special agent in the Washington, D.C. Federal Bureau of Investigation from 1943 to 1952. From 1952 to 1968, he was vice president and president, respectively, of ITT Communications Systems in Chicago, Illinois and Paramus, New Jersey. He became Commissioner of U.S. Customs in Washington, D.C. from 1969 to 1977, the same time span that Peter Wiedenieks was in and out of Customs. I called Dick Russell, author of The Man Who Knew Too Much, to act as a cutout for me and interview Chasen. At that point, I didn't want to expose myself to Wackenhut, so Russell agreed. When Russell called back, he said Chasen didn't trust Robert Booth Nichols. Wackenhut had run a check on Nichols and couldn't learn anything about his background. This had bothered Chasen, but, he said, Robert Fry and Dick Wilson were dazzled with Nichols. Chasen believed Nichols worked for the CIA, said he was a slippery guy, and couldn't understand why Fry and Wilson were dazzled by Nichols for such a long time. Reportedly, George Wackenhut liked Fry and Dick Wilson, but did not trust Riconosciuto or Nichols. Michael Riconosciuto had been introduced to Chasen as a specialist engineer in weapons. Chasen acknowledged the biological technology introduced by Nichols and Zokoski, saying it had been presented to him as something that could create anything from chicken soup to long-range missiles. When he learned of the properties of the technology, he halted it immediately. When pressed for further details, he added reluctantly, "It was the kind of thing your mind erases." Regarding the Cabazons, Chasen said he felt an affinity with Arthur Welmers, chairman of the Cabazon Band of Mission Indians, because Chasen's wife is part Cherokee. He noted that he sympathized with their situation and wanted to protect them. Perhaps he protected them more than he realized when he shut down the Wackenhut proposal to the Army to develop biological viruses and vaccines on the Cabazon Reservation. 1 year later, on September 5, 1994, Time magazine published an article on page 63 entitled, "A Deadly Virus Escapes," in which a Yale University researcher was exposed to the deadly Brazilian sabia virus when a container spinning on a high-speed centrifuge cracked, causing the potentially lethal tissue to spatter. Fortunately, the researcher was wearing a lab gown, latex gloves and a mask, as required by federal guidelines. Every surface of the area was scrubbed with bleach, all instruments were sterilized, then wiped down again with alcohol. Having decided the danger was over, he didn't bother to report the accident, and a few days later he left town to visit an old friend in Boston. Soon after the researcher returned to Yale, he began running a fever that reached 103F. An experimental antiviral drug eventually stopped the illness, but the man had exposed 5 people, including 2 children, before being confined to a hospital isolation ward, and another 75 or so healthcare workers after that. The Sabia virus is particularly frightening because it kills in such a grisly way. Characteristic symptoms are high fever, uncontrolled bleeding in virtually every organ, and finally shock. The liver turns yellow and decomposes. Blood can leak from literally every bodily orifice, including the eyes and the pores of the skin. Sabia was never seen before 1990, when a female agricultural engineer checked into a hospital in São Paulo, Brazil, with a high fever. Within days she was dead. Fortunately, in the Yale University incident, none of the potential victims died or showed any evidence of symptoms. A book and movie on the Sabia virus's counterpart, the lethal Ebola virus from Central Africa, which is as deadly and as gruesome as AIDS, yet has an incubation period of only 1 week, was underway at the time and was later released in 1994. The book, The Hot Zone, described a victim who contracted Ebola. Time wrote, "His eyes turn red and his head begins to ache. Red spots appear on his skin and, spreading quickly, become a rash of tiny blisters, and then the flesh rips. Blood begins to flow from every one of the body's orifices. The victim coughs up black vomit, sloughing off parts of his tongue, throat and windpipe. His organs fill with blood and fail. He suffers seizures, splattering virus-saturated blood that can infect anyone nearby. Within a few days the victim dies, and as the virus destroys his remaining cells, much of his tissue actually liquefies." The Ebola virus, found in the rainforest regions of Central Africa, once caused an outbreak in 1976 through villages near the Ebola River in Zaire, killing as many as 90% of those infected. "Such dangerous viruses may seem a distant menace," wrote Time, but the Hot Zone details a 1989 Ebola crisis that occurred in the Reston, Virginia primate quarantine unit, run by a company that imports and sells monkeys for use in research laboratories. When an unusual number of monkeys originating from the Philippines died, tissue samples were sent to U.S. Army Research Center. There a technician identified the strands as either Ebola Zaire or something very close. Even more alarming, the virus found in Reston, Virginia, unlike the African one, could be transmitted through the air. Frantic phone calls were made to Virginia health authorities and to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. An Army team, wearing spacesuits, went into the Reston building and killed 450 surviving monkeys, then placed them in plastic bags for safe disposal. Before the building was boarded up, the Army sterilized every square inch of the interior. No humans were infected with the virus, but Richard Preston, the author of The Hot Zone, wrote, "A tiny change in its genetic code, and it might have zoomed through the human race." A rival 1995 film on the same